Hello there, and welcome to our channel, where curiosity gets cozy and science takes the scenic route to slumber. Tonight, this quiet journey takes us to a place that feels as eternal as the stars above it, so old that even time seems to hesitate before entering. The Great Pyramid of Giza. It rises from the desert like a frozen wave of stone, serene and immovable, while the wind moves endlessly around it. You've seen it in pictures, of course, and maybe you've wondered, like so many before you, how on earth it was built. But what if that question isn't quite right? What if, instead of being built by the Egyptians we know from history books, it was something they found? What if they didn't create it, but inherited it a gift, or perhaps a mystery, from a civilization that came before? It's a strange thought, isn't it? And yet, it's one that refuses to go away. Before we go further, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? Somewhere quiet, maybe? Somewhere dim, with the hum of evening in the background. Imagine that, from wherever you are, the same moon that once watched over the construction of the Great Pyramid still looks down, patient and familiar. If you find these late-night musings soothing, if you enjoy wandering through mysteries in the soft light of reason, I'd be grateful if you like the video and perhaps subscribe. It helps this little corner of calm find others who enjoy drifting between history and sleep, where science and imagination meet halfway. So, let's take a slow breath. Let the noise of the day fade and begin this story, not with blueprints or chisels, but with a question that has lingered for centuries. What if the Egyptians were not the builders, but the heirs? The Great Pyramid, officially called the Pyramid of Khufu, stands on the Giza Plateau near modern Cairo. It's the last surviving wonder of the ancient world, older than most written languages, and so vast that, even standing at its base, it feels less like architecture and more like landscape. By conventional dating, it was constructed around 4,500 years ago during Egypt's 4th dynasty, supposedly as a tomb for Pharaoh Khufu. According to traditional archaeology, it took tens of thousands of laborers about 2 decades to complete, using copper tools, sleds, and simple ingenuity. It's an extraordinary story of organization and perseverance, one that has defined Egyptian civilization in the popular imagination. But there has something in the stones that doesn't quite line up with that tidy version of events. For one thing, erosion. Geological studies of the Sphinx and nearby structures have suggested weathering patterns that look less like the work of mere wind and sand and more like the slow, rounded wear of heavy rainfall. But rainfall of that magnitude hasn't touched Giza for thousands of years long before Khufu ever ruled. Some geologists have argued that the Sphinx could be far older than its accepted date. And though the pyramid itself shows less direct water erosion, it stands on the same plateau, in the same shifting sands, under the same long-forgotten skies. If the Sphinx could predate the dynasties, could the pyramid too have roots deeper than we imagine? There's a quiet allure to that possibility. Because if the Egyptians didn't build the Great Pyramid, then who did and why? The notion feels like something between archaeology and dream. The very idea that our history might have amnesia about its own beginnings stirs something ancient in us. It's comforting to think of history as a straight-line one invention, leading neatly to the next, each civilization learning from the last. But what if it isn't a line at all? What if it's a circle or a spiral, rising and falling through ages we've only half remembered? The stones themselves don't answer easily. Each block of the Great Pyramid weighs, on average, over 2 tons. Some weigh as much as 15. There are more than 2 million of them, fitted together with a precision that even modern engineers find unnerving. The joints between blocks are so tight you can't slip a credit card through them. And though the alignment of the pyramid, as sides to true north, is astonishingly accurate, achieved without compasses or satellites, it's not the only anomaly. The base is almost perfectly level, despite the uneven bedrock beneath. The internal passageways and chambers are aligned with mathematical precision, as though designed by someone who understood not only engineering, but geometry, astronomy, and perhaps even acoustics on a profound level. To imagine all of this achieved with copper chisels and wooden sleds stretches the imagination. And it is not that the ancient Egyptians were incapable of brilliance. They were, but that the scale of this particular brilliance seems to belong to an age of knowledge we can't quite trace. When you stand before the pyramid, you're looking at something that feels both human and inhuman, as though built by people like us, but with a patience and mastery that feel almost alien in their discipline. For centuries, explorers, scholars, and mystics have been drawn to this enigma. Napoleon stood before it and wept. Herodotus wrote about it with awe and confusion. Even now, scientists scan its depths with cosmic rays, searching for hidden chambers, while spiritual seekers speak of resonances, energies, harmonics. Somewhere between the measurable and the mysterious, the pyramid sits silently, giving nothing away. If the Egyptians inherited it, they did so gracefully. The hieroglyphs and inscriptions we associate with Egypt's monuments are conspicuously absent from the Great Pyramid's interior. Unlike later tombs, it contains no elaborate carvings or decoration, no grand proclamations of afterlife journeys, no murals celebrating the pharaoh's divine right. It's bare, almost clinical in its simplicity, devoid of art where we'd expect a celebration of ego. That quiet emptiness has always felt strange to archaeologists. Tombs were meant to be spoken spaces, echoing with prayers, offerings, stories for eternity. The Great Pyramid, by contrast, feels like a riddle whispered to itself. Some have suggested that the Egyptians found it already ancient, repurposed it for Khufu's name, and left their own marks elsewhere. If that's true, the pyramid might not only predate Egyptian civilization, it might have been part of a world that vanished, leaving only stone behind. Civilizations have risen and fallen countless times across the earth, but we rarely imagine that one could vanish so completely that only a single monument remains. Yet, the possibility is hauntingly real. If a culture had flourished before the great flood myths that appear in nearly every ancient tradition, it might have been lost not through conquest or decay, but through cataclysm. The Sahara, after all, wasn't always desert. Thousands of years ago, it was lush, green, alive with lakes and rivers. And evidence of prehistoric settlements, fish fossils, and ancient rainfall patterns show that what is now barren sand was once fertile. Perhaps people thrived there long before recorded history. Perhaps they built, measured, and mapped the stars. And perhaps, when the world changed, when the rain stopped and the sands advanced, they left behind what they could not carry. A pyramid may be less a monument and more a message, a structure too immense to be forgotten. When archaeologists study Egypt's early dynastic period, they find a sudden leap in sophistication. The shift from primitive settlements to monumental stone architecture happened so abruptly, it seems almost imported. How does a society go from simple mud brick structures to cutting, transporting, and fitting multi-ton limestone blocks with micrometer precision in just a few generations? Usually, knowledge leaves a trail. Smaller experiments, gradual refinements, visible steps between the impossible and the achieved. In Egypt, those steps seem to appear fully formed, as though the blueprint came from somewhere else. It's tempting to think of inheritance here, not in the literal sense of property, but in the deeper sense of legacy. Imagine an ancient people arriving at the plateau, already sacred in their myths. They find a structure massive, inert, awe-inspiring. To them, it isn't alien, it's divine. They name it, revere it, and weave it into their new world. The pyramid becomes theirs, not by creation, but by recognition. In that moment, history resets itself. The builders are forgotten. The inheritors become the remembered, and the story begins again under new sunlight. Even the alignment of the pyramid seems to echo a memory older than Egypt. Its orientation to the cardinal directions, and possible connection to the constellation Orion have inspired countless theories. Some argue that the layout of the three pyramids at Giza mirrors the stars of Orion's belt, suggesting a celestial purpose far beyond funerary use. If that alignment was deliberate, it might indicate a level of astronomical knowledge predating what we attribute to ancient Egypt. Star alignments drift over millennia due to precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis. So if the alignment was ever perfect, it could date the structure to a time thousands of years before Khufu's reign. Yet orthodox Egyptology resists such revisions, partly because rewriting timelines means unanchoring everything else that depends on them. Still, the data persists and the questions remain. The Great Pyramid is not an outlier. It's a paradox. Every time it's studied, it seems both more understandable and more mysterious. It fits in history, but only just. It feels both modern and prehistoric, a bridge between worlds that shouldn't have met. Standing there, you might imagine a worker lifting his gaze from the stone, watching the sun set over the Nile. Was he carving history, or merely preserving it? Maybe he didn't know. Maybe none of them did. To build something you don't fully understand isn't uncommon. We do it all the time. We inherit technologies, languages, ideas. We add to them, reshape them, and eventually call them ours. It could be that the ancient Egyptians did the same, not with words or mathematics, but with stone. They took what they found and built around it, a civilization that would endure for millennia. Even if they inherited the pyramid, they gave it a new story, one that turned stone into myth and myth into identity. And in that sense, the Egyptians did build it. If not from scratch, then in spirit. They built its meaning. They turned an inexplicable artifact into the cornerstone of their culture, something that defined their relationship with eternity. Maybe that is the truest kind of inheritance, the ability to find meaning in what was left behind. As night settles over the desert, the temperature drops sharply. The air cools, the sand sighs, and the stars appear, the same constellations that watched the pyramid's first sunrise. Somewhere out there in the dark, the Nile glints faintly, winding through the landscape like a thread of silver. Everything seems still, but nothing is truly still. The desert moves grain by grain. Time moves thought by thought, and the pyramid remains, balancing between past and present. You might close your eyes and imagine what the first Egyptians saw when they arrived here, long before cities and empires. A shape too precise to be natural, too silent to be alive, too enduring to ignore. Maybe they approached it cautiously, unsure whether it was sacred or dangerous. Maybe they listened for voices in the stone. Maybe they decided it was the work of gods, because anything that survives so long without explanation must be divine. And maybe, in naming it, in claiming it, they began the story that would carry Egypt through thousands of years of history. Whether it was built by them or found by them, the Great Pyramid became part of who they were, a symbol of continuity in a world that constantly changed. It became a calendar, a compass, a metaphor, a mystery all at once. And perhaps that's what matters most. Not who built it, but how it continues to build meaning even now. We stand before it millennia later and still ask the same questions, still wonder at the same stones, still feel the same mixture of awe and confusion. That's the real inheritance, the unbroken chain of curiosity. And as we move quietly from this thought to the next, imagine the wind over Giza, carrying the faint echo of human voices, distant and indistinct, saying what humans have always said when faced with something greater than themselves. How did they do this? Why did they do this? Who came before us? The desert doesn't answer, but it listens. And in that silence, our next thought begins to form about the mysteries still buried beneath the sand, waiting for history to remember them. If you stand on the Giza Plateau in the quiet of early morning before the crowds arrive and the heat begins to rise, you can almost hear it. A faint hum, not of sound exactly, but of presence. The desert seems to breathe. Wind moves through the sand in long sighs, soft as memory. And beneath that surface lies something older than all our stories. Beneath your feet, there are layers of sediment, limestone, and silence built up over countless ages. And somewhere under that silence, the earth keeps its secrets. The Great Pyramid stands near the edge of it all, a sentinel gazing toward the horizon. But around it, the ground holds its own quiet record of time. When people first began to excavate here in the modern era, they expected treasures, chambers, perhaps even writings that would explain how such a thing came to be. What they found instead was emptiness. Beneath the sand, scattered tools, bones, pottery shards, yes, but not enough to tell a clear story. The pyramid itself sat like a thought carved in stone, unaccompanied by the chatter of everyday life that usually surrounds construction on such a scale. There were workers' villages nearby, true, but even those seemed curiously simple compared to the monument they supposedly supported. Mud brick homes, storage, pits bred oven signs of a practical workforce, but not of the kind of technological surge that the structure itself implies. It was as if the pyramid had appeared first, and the rest of civilization had arranged itself around it later, like planets orbiting a silent sun. The desert has always hidden and revealed things in its own time. What's lost isn't truly gone, here only buried. Sand covers, protects, forgets for a while, then shifts and gives something back. A piece of pottery, a tomb, a statue with its face worn smooth. Archaeologists know this rhythm well, yet even they admit that Giza feels different. There's a sense of waiting here, as though the plateau itself knows more than it's letting on. Under the dunes, there are layers of construction. Ancient walls, causeways, tunnels that don't all belong to the same period. They overlap like palimpsests, one civilization reusing the bones of another. Each new discovery pushes the timeline a little further back, a little deeper, like peeling away the pages of an endless book written in stone dust. One of the most intriguing whispers from beneath the desert sand came not from pottery or scrolls, but from the ground itself. Geophysical surveys have found anomalies beneath the Sphinx and parts of the Giza Plateau, chambers, cavities, shapes that don't match natural formations. Some of these spaces have been partially explored. Others remain sealed, waiting for technologies delicate enough to study them without harm. Among researchers, there's debate about what these voids might be. Storage rooms, natural fissures, or perhaps the remnants of an older structure, one that predates what we recognize as ancient Egypt. The instruments don't answer directly. They only hint. But those hints align eerily well with what certain old legends have been saying all along. Long before modern archaeology, there were stories among Egyptians themselves that the pyramids were older than memory. Medieval Arab historians like al-Makrizi and Ibn Wasil recorded accounts from local traditions that the pyramids had been built not by the pharaohs, but by a mysterious people before the Great Flood, a civilization of knowledge and power wiped away when the world changed. They claimed the pyramids were repositories of that ancient wisdom libraries of stone built to preserve the science of the stars and the earth before catastrophe struck. To most modern scholars, these are myths, poetic fabrications passed down through oral tradition. Yet myths often carry a trace of truth, a fossil of something once real, shaped by centuries of retelling. Even the oldest Egyptian texts, like the pyramid texts of Saqqara, speak of times before kings, before names, when the gods themselves walked the earth. The line between deity and ancestor blurs in those verses. They describe the builders of the first monuments not as mortals, but as beings closer to the divine architects of harmony between heaven and earth. The stories never say who they were, only that the later Egyptians remembered them with reverence and fear. It's tempting to interpret those words as symbolic. But what if they weren't? What if those gods were simply the distant memory of people who came long before humans, whose technology and understanding seemed godlike to those who followed. When scientists study the bedrock beneath the Giza Plateau, they find signs of ancient quarrying that doesn't always match the known timeline of Egyptian construction. There are cuts in the limestone that do into line with the quarrying methods of the 4th Dynasty grooves, whose tool marks are inconsistent with copper implements. Some are smooth in ways that suggest techniques beyond simple chiseling and pounding. To the untrained eye, such details might seem trivial, but to geologists, they raise quiet questions about continuity. If the Egyptians learned to build by quarrying the same stone their predecessors had already cut, they may have inherited not only the land, but the infrastructure of a civilization forgotten to time. And then there's the erosion. We touched on it before, but the weathering of the Sphinx enclosure tells a deeper story here. The walls show rounded, undulating patterns, signs of heavy rainfall, not desert wind. The last time that region saw significant rain was during the end of the last ice age, around 10,000 BCE. That's nearly twice as old as the conventional dating of the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid. It's not definitive proof, but it suggests that something monumental existed on this plateau long before Egypt as we know it. If the Sphinx was indeed carved or reshaped from a much older structure, perhaps the same hands or the same tradition gave rise to the earliest foundations of Giza. Beneath the sand in the geological record lies a quiet argument that refuses to be silenced. Still, archaeology moves carefully. Extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. For every geologist suggesting great antiquity, there are others insisting the erosion could be explained by local conditions or groundwater. The debate continues, polite but persistent, echoing through conferences and papers like wind through corridors of stone. Yet, regardless of who is correct, the deeper truth remains. Our understanding of history is constantly being rewritten by what the earth reveals. Every grain of sand displaced by wind or spade might be a letter in a story we haven't finished reading. Sometimes, when scanning beneath the ground with radar or MON detectors, scientists find voids so precise that they seem intentional, as though someone long ago carved them to hold something, perhaps a structure, perhaps knowledge, perhaps nothing at all. It is possible these spaces are relics of early construction experiments abandoned by workers who later refined their methods. Or maybe they remnants of a far older phase of human history, one that didn't leave behind writing or pottery, only geometry and stone. The thought is humbling that the deeper we dig, the further back the trail seems to lead until it dissolves into mystery. The desert silence isn't empty. It's full of time. Every particle of dust that drifts across the plateau has been carried by centuries of wind, touched by countless suns. When explorers of the 19th century began to document Giza in earnest, they recorded not just the monuments, but also the strange sensations that came with standing there. The feeling that the place was alive, aware, as if watching back. Some dismissed it as fatigue or heat stroke. Others, more poetically inclined, wondered if the land itself held memory. If stones could dream, they said, the pyramids would be their thoughts. There's a reason so many myths place lost knowledge beneath the sand. In nearly every culture that speaks of ancient cataclysms, there's a notion of buried wisdom. Scrolls sealed in caves, temples hidden under dunes, cities swallowed whole by the earth. We imagine that the past doesn't just fade, it sinks. And in Egypt, where the desert acts as both destroyer and preserver, that idea feels tangible. Archaeologists working near Giza have uncovered layers of older settlements beneath newer ones, each representing a different chapter of civilization. Who's to say how many more layers might lie below unreachable for now, waiting quietly? Some researchers have speculated that the Giza Plateau was chosen not merely for its elevation or proximity to the Nile, but because of what was already here. If the land itself was sacred, perhaps containing earlier monuments or markers, Egyptians may have built upon it intentionally, aligning their own creations with structures they believed to be divine. This would explain why Giza's layout follows a celestial pattern that seems to predate recorded Egyptian astronomy. The pyramids, rather than being independent inventions, could be continuations of an older plan of cosmic architecture inherited through myth. Legends from neighboring regions echo similar themes. In Sumerian tablets, there are references to ancient builders called the Anunnaki beings, said to have raised cities and monuments before the flood. In later Greek traditions, Herodotus described Egyptian priests, telling him that their civilization stretched back tens of thousands of years, far beyond the dates historians would later assign. The priests themselves might not have known what that meant literally, but perhaps they were repeating a cultural memory one, preserved in temple stories long after the evidence had been buried. Oral traditions are elastic. They can stretch across millennia, preserving impressions even when details vanish. Of course, the challenge is that myths blur truth and imagination until they're inseparable. A legend might begin as fact and end as allegory. But if even a fragment of those stories points to real events, catastrophes, migrations, or rediscoveries, then the ground beneath the Great Pyramid might hold traces of civilizations that survived in memory, but not in material form. The desert, indifferent as it seems, has been the stage for such vanishings countless times. Whole towns have been swallowed by shifting dunes in less than a century. Given thousands of years, what might it erase? And what might it accidentally preserve perfectly sealed under sand and heat? When night falls on Giza, the air cools again and the desert stillness deepens. Beneath that silence, microseisms ripple faintly tiny vibrations of the Earth's crust, carrying echoes from kilometers below. In those vibrations lies an entire archive of the planet's past, layers upon layers of soundless data. Geologists can read it like music. Ancient rivers that once flowed here, shifts in groundwater, the grinding movement of tectonic plates. The ground is not dead. It remembers, just in a language we've only begun to understand. And perhaps, among those layers, the remnants of some forgotten chapter still linger, encoded in stone and soil. Sometimes, I think about what it must have felt like for the first modern explorers who brushed the sand away from a block of limestone that hadn't seen sunlight in thousands of years. The realization that you were the first human to touch that surface since a civilization disappeared must have been overwhelming. That's the strange gift of archaeology. It collapses time. A small object, a tool, a footprint can make thousands of years vanish in an instant. You feel the past breathe again, just faintly, through dust and air. The desert gives you that moment, then closes itself once more patient as ever. If the Egyptians did inherit the Great Pyramid, they inherited not just a monument, but the mystery that came with it. They might have stood where we stand now, wondering who came before them, listening to the same wind, asking the same questions. Maybe they looked at the older weathering on the stones, puzzled by its cause. Maybe they found remnants of an earlier culture beneath their own foundations. Perhaps even then, there were whispers beneath the sand, telling them they were not the first and would not be the last. History might not always begin where we think it does. Sometimes it resumes. And as we move quietly forward in this thought, imagine the sands of Giza continuing their slow drift through centuries, uncovering, rearranging the memories of the world grain by grain. The desert doesn't hurry. It knows that everything buried will one day return to light. And so it waits, just as we do, for the next whisper to rise from beneath the dunes and remind us how much of our past still sleeps untouched beneath our feet. The more you look at the Great Pyramid, the more it feels like it is holding back a story. Not the one we already know from history books, the one with kings and hieroglyphs and long processions of laborers, but another story, quieter, older, and almost invisible. The surface we see is familiar, but beneath that surface, in the lines of the stone and the way the light touches its edges, there is a sense of memory. It's as if the monument itself has seen too many ages to belong entirely to one of them. The sand may have hidden its foundations, but something else hides its origins. If the Egyptians inherited it, then someone long before them must have built it. Whoever they were, their fingerprints have faded. Their names have turned to dust, and their legacy remains not in words, but in the endurance of the stone itself. These are the forgotten builders, the ones whose story we can't read, but can still feel, like the faint warmth of a vanished fire. Imagine the world as it might have been when they lived. The desert wasn't yet a desert. The Nile's course might have wandered across greener land, flowing through wide valleys where herds grazed and trees stretched toward a wetter sky. Rain fell more often then, carving gentle paths through the limestone that would one day cradle the pyramids. Perhaps there were forests not far from what is now Cairo, and the air smelled of earth and fresh water rather than dust and heat. This was a different Egypt, a prehistoric landscape, alive with sound and movement. People were there, scattered in small communities, hunting, gathering, learning to shape stone and fire. But among them, perhaps, were others people who knew how to do more than survive. People who understood the stars and seasons, who could measure the turning of the earth not by guesswork but by calculation. They may not have had the trappings of civilization as we define it, but they had knowledge. And knowledge leaves traces that outlast language. When archaeologists talk about the prehistoric Nile Valley, they often mention how abruptly the great civilizations appear. Before the Old Kingdom, before the first pharaohs unified the land, there were centuries of simpler life, farming, fishing, trading along the river. And then, almost without warning, monumental architecture emerges. It's not a gradual climb, it's a leap. Some see this as the natural outcome of societal growth, the point at which population and resources align with ambition. Others see something missing between the layers, a gap where an earlier foundation should be. That gap may not be an empty space in time, but a buried one erased by flood, erosion, or the slow forgetfulness of generations. Humanity has been building things for far longer than written records suggest. Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey is more than 11,000 years old, built before agriculture, before cities, before the wheel. Its stone pillars are carved with images of animals and symbols that no one has yet deciphered. It was built by people who, according to every model of human development, shouldn't have been able to build something that complex. Yet Theraselite stands, rewriting what we thought we knew. If such builders existed there, it is unreasonable to wonder if others existed elsewhere, perhaps along the Nile, leaving behind structures that would one day be mistaken for Egyptian. The forgotten builders may not have been a single people, but a thread running through humanity, as early experiments with permanence, a thread that led from one monument to another, teaching by example rather than by inheritance. What is striking about the Great Pyramid is how little it resembles the early pyramids that supposedly came before it. The Step Pyramid of Djoser, often called the first pyramid, is a marvel in its own right, but its design is transitional. Made of smaller blocks stacked in visible layers, a clear evolution from mastabas, the rectangular tombs of earlier kings. Then, suddenly, with Khufu, perfection. No visible experimentation, no learning curve, just an abrupt mastery of scale and precision. The transition between Djoser's stepped monument and Khufu's geometric perfection happens within just a few generations, an implausibly short time for such a monumental leap in technique. If you compare it to how long it took humanity to progress from mud brick houses to cathedrals, the acceleration seems unnatural, unless, of course, they weren't starting from scratch. When you think of lost civilizations, it's easy to imagine myths. Atlantis, Lemuria, Hyperboreal, those poetic inventions of the 19th century that tried to explain gaps in archaeology with grand stories of vanished worlds. But the idea of forgotten builders doesn't require such mythology. Civilizations don't have to sink beneath the ocean to disappear. They only have to lose continuity. A drought, a flood, a disease, Or the slow migration of people away from their centers of knowledge can erase centuries of progress. The survivors remember fragments, not systems. The methods are lost, the meanings fade, and the descendants begin again inheriting tools, but not instructions. They rebuild with what they can recall, sometimes perfectly, sometimes not at all. If the Great Pyramid represents such a moment, then it may have been the reawakening of an older tradition, not its beginning. There are hints in Egyptian mythology that support this idea, though they're wrapped in metaphor. In their oldest cosmology, the gods themselves come from an age before the flood, before chaos returned to the world. They speak of a primeval mound rising from the waters, the first dry land upon which the gods began creation. The pyramid, in shape and symbolism, mirrors that mound perfectly. It's the Earth's first hill, frozen in stone, a recreation of the beginning of time. To the Egyptians, it was both symbol and memory. But perhaps the memory was older than they realized. Perhaps the forgotten builders were not gods, but ancestors, and what later became religion was once recollection. Many of the world's oldest structures are built with an obsession for orientation, to the stars, to solstices, to equinoxes. The Great Pyramid follows this pattern precisely. Its sides align almost perfectly with the cardinal directions, deviating by only a fraction of a degree, an accuracy difficult to achieve even with modern instruments. Its internal shafts point toward specific stars as they appeared thousands of years ago, not as they would have in Khufu's time. This has led some researchers to suggest that the knowledge used to design it was inherited drawn from an older epoch when those stars occupied different positions. If so, the forgotten builders may have encoded not just architecture, but astronomy, a kind of message left for those who would later rediscover it. What we can say for certain is that whoever designed the pyramid understood mathematics in a way that feels timeless. The ratio of its base to its height approximates the mathematical constant pi. Its proportions also reflect the golden ratio, a harmony found throughout nature and art. Whether by design or coincidence, the structure embodies principles that wouldn't be formally defined for millennia. Some see that as proof of advanced knowledge. Others see it as evidence that mathematical beauty is universal, that any culture striving for perfection would inevitably find the same patterns. Either way, the builders, known or forgotten, were not guessing. They were measuring something both external and internal, seeking a kind of order that mirrored the cosmos itself. The mystery of their tools persists. Copper chisels are soft, far too soft to cut granite efficiently. The inner chambers of the pyramid contain large granite blocks, some weighing over 50 tons, quarried from Aswan, nearly 900 kilometers away. Transporting and placing such blocks with precision, even today, would require equipment and planning of extraordinary complexity. No traces of cranes, pulleys, or machines have been found. Yet the stones are there, each one fitted so precisely that it almost feels grown rather than constructed. Some experiments have shown that ramps could have been used, but the logistics of maintaining such ramps over the pyramid's immense height make the theory cumbersome. Others suggest internal spirals, counterweights, or lost mechanical ingenuity. None of it feels conclusive. Perhaps that's the most haunting thing about the forgotten builders. Their work remains, but their methods vanished completely, as if erased deliberately, or simply lost in the attrition of centuries. In the absence of records, we rely on inference, and inference is a fragile bridge across millennia. Still, even the most skeptical archaeologists admit that Egypt's early sophistication arrives startlingly early. The sudden appearance of writing, administration, art, and monumental architecture within a relatively narrow time frame suggests that something accelerated their development. Whether it was internal genius, external influence, or a rediscovery of buried knowledge, the effect is the same. The civilization that rose along the Nile seemed to begin halfway through its own story. Some researchers have proposed that, before the dynasties, there might have been localized centers of culture, small groups of people with specialized, Knowledge that didn't survive intact, but seeded ideas wherever they went. They might not have built empires, but they built prototypes. When those groups vanished, their ideas remained as ruins or legends, waiting for the next civilization to stumble upon them. Egypt, in this view, was less an isolated miracle and more a revival, the next verse of a song that had been paused for a few thousand years. The forgotten builders, if they existed, might not have been strangers from another world or era of technology as we know it, but simply earlier humans at their own peak of understanding, using methods and materials now lost to us. The human story isn't linear. It's full of rises and falls. Civilizations are fragile. Knowledge can vanish in a single generation if it isn't passed on. Languages die, skills fade. Even now, in our own time, we forget technologies within decades when they become obsolete. Imagine stretching that process over thousands of years, with floods, wars, and migrations in between. How much would survive? Maybe just enough to inspire myths and one monument too heavy for time to erase. When modern engineers study the pyramid, they often describe it in terms of efficiency. The design minimizes error, distributes weight flawlessly, and resists earthquakes. It's not just beautiful, it's durable. In a way, it's the perfect metaphor for knowledge itself. Simple at a glance, intricate in structure, almost indestructible. Whoever built it, known or unknown, understood something about permanence. They built not for themselves, but for time. They must have known that civilizations come and go, that kings rise and fall, and that the only way to speak to the future is through something the future cannot easily destroy. Perhaps that's why we still listen for their voices. We look for their traces in stone quarries, in weathered faces of statues, in the faint patterns left on the desert floor. We find alignments that point to constellations, mathematical relationships that echo nature. And we wonder if these were their messages. Maybe they knew the earth would forget them. Maybe they wanted to make sure it didn't forget everything. As night deepens over the plateau, the stars return scattering across the sky in the same formation they veiled for tens of thousands of years. Some of them, the ones over Orion's belt, seem to mirror the shapes below, as though the builders drew their plans not from the ground, but from the heavens. The air cools, the sand settles, and the pyramid casts its long shadow toward the river that once fed empires. The forgotten builders remain nameless, but their presence is everywhere, in every angle, every joint, every echo that lingers when the wind moves through the stones. We may never find their graves, their tools, or their words, but we can still sense them in the design, in the endurance, in the silence that hangs around the monument like a memory too heavy to fade. They were here. We know it because the stones remember what names cannot. And as the wind drifts softly over Giza, carrying grains of sand that have moved across centuries, it's hard not to wonder if the next gust will uncover something new. A trace, a clue, a whisper from those who built before history began writing. The forgotten builders are gone, but their work endures a message to all who follow. That time erases much, but not everything. And just beyond the reach of our certainty, beyond the edges of the known, their world still flickers faintly, buried beneath the desert, waiting to be remembered again. When you follow the curve of the Nile far enough in thought, it begins to dissolve into time itself. The river has always been Egypt's pulse, winding and coiling through desert and memory. It gave life to the land, and in return, the land gave meaning to time. Every flood, every retreat of its waters was a measure of heartbeat in the long rhythm of civilization. But what if the Nile once flowed under a very different sky? Not just in the sense of constellations drifting slightly over millennia, but truly different, a sky older than Egypt, older even than the idea of Egypt, when the stars marked a world that no longer exists. If the Great Pyramid was built, or perhaps rebuilt, by those who came after, then the ones who first shaped this land might have lived beneath that older sky. The earth itself was different then. The Sahara wasn't yet the ocean of sand it would become. It was alive, dotted with lakes and savannas. Rivers ran where dunes now stretch endlessly. The climate shifted slowly at first, then abruptly, until what was once fertile turned dry. Scientists call this the African humid period, a time when monsoon rains reached deep into what is now barren wilderness. It ended roughly 5,000 years ago, around the same time Egypt's civilization began to bloom. One story was ending while another was beginning, the desert reclaiming one world as it made room for another. When the Nile remembered a different sky, its floods came not just from mountain snow, but from rains that soaked the highlands year after year. The air was thick with humidity. Storms rolled across the horizon, and the landscape would have felt lush compared to the Egypt we know. The people who lived here before the pharaohs would have followed the river's moods closely. They would have known its language long before they gave it a name. To them, it may not have been a border between kingdoms, but a bridge between worlds. And somewhere in that green corridor of prehistory, perhaps long before Khufu, someone looked up at the night sky and decided that what happened above and below were connected. The stars then were the same, but their positions weren't. The slow wobble of the Earth's axis, a motion called precession, changes the orientation of the heavens over tens of thousands of years. Constellations rise and set at different points. The pole star shifts. Alignments that seemed symbolic to us now might have been literal once. The pyramid's precise relationship to Orion's belt, for instance, could reflect an era when those stars occupied positions matching the layout at Giza more exactly than they do today. Astronomers have traced that alignment back not to 2500 BCE, when Khufu ruled, but to around 10,500 BCE, a time that coincides with the end of the last ice age and the beginning of that African humid period. It's a coincidence, perhaps, but a compelling one. If true, it would mean that whoever conceived of that design lived under a sky unfamiliar to recorded history. It's not just the stars that changed. The very rhythm of the Nile itself shifted. Core samples taken from the riverbed show alternating layers of silt and clay, marking the cycle of floods through thousands of years. In some of those layers, there are interruptions, periods of lower flow, times when the river thinned, when drought must have driven people to migrate. Each migration could have scattered knowledge across regions, dispersing what might once have been concentrated. Perhaps the wisdom of the early builders wasn't lost all at once, but diluted, passed on in fragments like a language gradually forgotten. The Nile, carrying their memories downstream, would have borne silent witness to it all. When we talk about ancient Egypt, we often imagine an eternal landscape. But the truth is that Egypt has shifted as much as its history. The floodplain has moved, the delta has grown. Whole branches of the Nile have dried up. Some archaeologists believe that, in the distant past, the river's course may have flowed closer to the Giza Plateau than it does today, making it easier to transport the heavy stones used in construction. But if that course was older, much older, it might also explain why the plateau was chosen in the first place. The forgotten builders, whoever they were, could have selected it not for convenience, but for alignment, perhaps matching the river to celestial patterns. If the Nile once mirrored the Milky Way, as some suggest, then the pyramids could have represented a terrestrial reflection of the heavens above, a map of the stars drawn in stone and water. The Egyptians themselves held this belief deeply. They saw the sky not as separate from the earth, but as its twin. The goddess Nut arched above, her body forming the firmament, while the god Geb lay beneath the land itself. Between them flowed the Nile, the living thread connecting both. To them, the stars were not distant suns, but ancestors divine and eternal, guiding the rhythm of life below. It isn't difficult to imagine that this idea wasn't entirely their own, but something inherited, a worldview born under that earlier, wetter sky, when the connection between heaven and earth wasn't philosophical, but physical. Perhaps the first to trace those stars did so with mud on their fingers and river water at their feet, marking patterns on the ground that would one day become the foundations of pyramids. Over time, the climate changed. The rain stopped, the lakes evaporated, and the green world shrank into pockets along the Nile. The people who once lived farther west began to move eastward, drawn to the last reliable water source. With them came memories, rituals, stories perhaps, even knowledge of the stars. They might have carried fragments of an older science, the kind that doesn't need books to survive, only repetition. They could have taught the early Egyptians how to measure the sky, how to track the solstice, how to read the rhythm of the flood. Bit by bit, the new civilization that rose along the Nile became a mosaic of older ones, each layer built on the one before, just as the river built its own banks from centuries of silt. If you were standing there during that transition, you wouldn't have noticed it happening. The changes were slow, almost imperceptible. Each generation would have known only its own landscape, its own sky. But in the geological record, it's all written clearly. The slow desiccation of the Sahara, the retreat of vegetation, the rise of dust storms that still sweep across North Africa today. The Nile itself became both the refuge and the archive of that transformation, carrying the last sediments of lost lakes and rivers out to sea. And on its eastern bank, humans adapted, building something enduring in the face of all that loss. The Great Pyramid, if it is indeed older in essence than our history allows, might have been their monument to permanence, a statement against the impermanence they saw everywhere around them. The idea that the pyramids were aligned with Orion isn't just symbolic, it's geometric. The distance and angles between the three main pyramids at Giza correspond closely to the relative positions of the three stars in Orion's belt. The smallest of the pyramids is slightly offset, just as the smallest star, Mintaka, is. This pattern repeats with uncanny precision. To those who study archaeoastronomy, this suggests deliberate intent, not coincidence. And if the alignment truly reflects the sky as it appeared around 10,500 BCE, then the builders must have possessed knowledge of precession, something modern science didn't rediscover until the ancient Greeks thousands of years later. How did they know? Were they observing the heavens for millennia, keeping records in some form we no longer have? Or were they following instructions left by those who came before, honoring a design whose meaning even they only partly understood? It's a humbling thought that knowledge might outlive understanding. You can imagine an ancient architect standing on the plateau, following measurements inherited from an earlier generation, aligning his work to stars that no longer matched exactly, but trusting the pattern anyway. He might not have known why those specific angles mattered, only that they did. In that sense, even the Egyptians themselves could have been remembering through building, preserving a dialogue with the sky that began before their time. The Nile would have reflected that same sky, shimmering with stars in its surface each night, turning the world above into a mirror of the world below. At certain times of year, when the floodwaters rose, the reflections would have been perfect. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens, and its ghost lay across the river. To stand there at night, with the water glinting faintly and the pyramids dark against the horizon, must have felt like standing at the intersection of two worlds. It's no wonder the Egyptians saw death not as an end, but as a journey between them. The pyramid might not have been a tomb at all in its earliest conception, but a kind of portal, a bridge between earth and stars. Later, when its origin was forgotten, that symbolism might have solidified into religion. The practical became sacred, the functional became divine, and memory became myth. Even in our own time, the river still carries hints of that connection. During certain alignments, the sun sets directly between the pyramids, flooding the landscape with gold. It's a reminder that the geometry of the place isn't arbitrary. It's alive. Every line and angle catches light with purpose. Every shadow tells time. The Nile, flowing endlessly beside it, reflects not just the sun, but the continuity of observation itself. The builders, known or unknown, designed something that wouldn't just endure in space, but also in motion, forever tied to the cycles of the earth and sky. The more we study ancient Egypt, the more it seems that their greatest monuments were as much about remembering as they were about building. Their civilization was obsessed with continuity, with linking themselves to the past, with preserving names, stories, and rituals so that nothing would truly die. Perhaps that instinct came from their ancestors, from those who lived through the loss of a world. To inherit a desert that was once paradise is to learn that time changes everything. To build something that resists that change is to defy forgetting. The Nile's earlier sky might have faded, but its reflection remained etched in stone. If the river could speak, it might tell us about the civilizations that rose and fell along its banks long before the pharaohs. It might describe people who watched the same constellations, mapped the same heavens, and left behind markers we've mistaken for beginnings rather than continuations. It might whisper of a time when the stars we see tonight shone from slightly different places, when the earth tilted just a little differently, when the balance between water and desert still hung in delicate tension. And it might remind us that the stones at Giza, however still they seem, were once part of a living landscape, a world of rain, vegetation, and stars remembered only through the monuments left behind. Some nights, if you stand by the river long enough, you can almost imagine that earlier sky. The horizon feels broader, the stars brighter, the air thicker with life. The sound of water replaces the hum of cities. It's not time travel exactly, just a sense of connection to something vast and ongoing. The Nile has seen empires come and go, languages change, and gods replaced by new names. But the flow itself hasn't stopped. It continues to remember even when we forget. And so, when we look at the Great Pyramid and its perfect orientation, we're not just seeing architecture. We're seeing the memory of the sky, the ancient knowledge of motion, light, and time carved into immovable stone. The builders, whether they were Egyptians or those who came before, didn't just measure the earth. They measured change itself, the slow drift of stars, the eternal dialogue between the heavens and the river that reflected them. The Nile may have forgotten the rain that once fed it, but the sky it mirrored is still there, moving quietly above, reminding us that everything changes, and yet everything continues. And somewhere within that reflection, beneath the layers of sand and centuries, the next thought is waiting. The idea of how those who inherited such wonders made them their own shaping myths, gods and identities around what they found, turning the inheritance of stone into the foundation of a civilization. If the Egyptians truly inherited the Great Pyramid, then what they inherited wasn't just stone. They inherited mystery. They inherited silence. They inherited something so enormous, so precise, so utterly beyond the needs of ordinary life that it could not simply exist without purpose. And when people encounter something that endures beyond their understanding, they give it meaning. They build stories around it. They transform it into faith. The stone becomes divine, and divinity becomes a mirror for human wonder. In a sense, this is where Egypt as we know it begins, not in the act of building, but in the act of interpreting what was already there. Imagine arriving in a land that feels ancient, even as your own history is young. The rivers still flow, the stars still wheel overhead, but the monuments standing before you seem to belong to another world. The people of early Egypt may have seen the Great Pyramid as a relic of gods rather than humans. To them, its geometry, its endurance, its perfection, these were signs not of craftsmanship, but of eternity itself. It would have felt less like a building and more like a threshold, a door between this life and whatever waited beyond. Over time, they would weave that door into their cosmology, shaping an entire religion around what it symbolized. In Egypt, gods were never distant. They were woven into daily existence, into the sun's rise, the river's flood, the growth of crops. Every cycle had its deity, every motion of nature a name. The pharaoh, too, was divine not because of who he was, but because of the world he inherited. His role was to maintain balance, to keep the order of the cosmos, what they called Mayat. If he failed, chaos would return. But what if that entire system of belief, so intricate and enduring, was built upon something older? An older kind of balance, one reflected in the very stones of Giza. If those who came before had already created a monument that aligned heaven and earth with flawless precision, then to those who followed, the message would have been clear. The gods are not above us. They are here in the patterns of the world itself. To inherit a structure like the Great Pyramid would be to inherit a responsibility to explain it, to justify it, to bring it into harmony with the beliefs of the time. The Egyptians, masters of symbolism, would have seen meaning in every angle, every shadow. The ascending passages might represent the journey of the soul. The alignment with the stars could mark the path of resurrection. The stillness at the core of the king's chamber, silent and sealed, might have seemed like the resting heart of creation itself. Whether those interpretations were guesses or revelations, they gave the structure new life. It became theirs through understanding, even if that understanding was different from its original intent. The act of inheritance often involves transformation. When a culture adopts something from the past, it rarely preserves it unchanged. It interprets, it reshapes, it layers new meaning atop old foundations. In the same way, the Egyptians may have inherited both the monuments and the myths that surrounded them, then refined them into the intricate theology that defined their civilization. Their gods, their rituals, their architecture, all could have been echoes of earlier beliefs reframed for a new age. The builders of old may have left behind alignments and symbols that were later reimagined as the language of gods. Over centuries, what was once geometry became theology, and what was once engineering became devotion. There's something profoundly human in that transformation. When faced with something we don't fully understand, we often give it story. We personify it, honor it, make it sacred. The Egyptians did this better than anyone. Their temples were not just places of worship, they were microcosms of the universe. Every wall, every column, every color followed cosmic proportions. The same could be said of the Great Pyramid, though its simplicity hides its complexity. There are no carvings inside, no depictions of deities, no prayers etched into its surfaces. To later generations, that emptiness must have felt deliberate. It was too purposeful to be an oversight. The absence of art became the most powerful statement of all. It invited interpretation. It demanded reverence. So they filled that silence with gods. They imagined the pyramid as the resting place of Ra, the sun god, whose daily death and rebirth mirrored the cycle of life itself. Others saw it as the stairway to the heavens, the path Osiris took after his death, guiding souls toward eternal life. Still others believed embodied the Benben stone, the first mound to emerge from the primeval waters at the dawn of creation. Each interpretation layered meaning upon meaning until the structure became not just a monument, but a theology of stone. And yet, within those interpretations lies an echo, a faint trace of something older, something remembered rather than invented. When archaeologists study Egyptian religion, they find evidence of deep continuity. The same symbols appear again and again from the earliest dynasties to the very end of the empire. The Ankh, the scarab, the solar disk, the Eye of Horus. These weren't arbitrary motifs. They were part of a worldview that linked life, death, and rebirth into a single unbroken cycle. The Nile's annual flood reinforced that belief, washing away the old and nourishing the new. The sky's rotation echoed it, too, the stars disappearing and reappearing with perfect rhythm. It's as though the Egyptians saw the entire cosmos as a set of mirrors reflecting a single truth, that nothing truly ends. The Great Pyramid standing between river and sky may have been their greatest mirror of all. If that worldview was inherited from an older civilization, it means the Egyptians didn't invent eternity. They rediscovered it. They found it encoded in the stones themselves, in the proportions, in the alignment, in the quiet perfection of a structure that seemed to belong to no specific time. Perhaps they saw the pyramid as proof that the world had always been ordered, that the divine was not something to be sought, but something already built into existence. It would have been both reassuring and humbling. To inherit such perfection is to be reminded of one's place in the grand design. Even the concept of divine kingship might trace back to that inheritance. The pharaoh was seen as the living embodiment of Horus, the bridge between gods and men. But perhaps the idea of bridging itself, the concept of a human standing between heaven and earth, was inspired by monuments that already embodied that connection physically. The pyramid's apex points directly toward the sky. Its base rests on the earth, and the entire structure balances between the two. It's both grounded and transcendent, both human and cosmic. In that sense, the pharaoh didn't just rule over Egypt. He represented the structure of reality itself. He was the pyramid in flesh. Inheriting something that predates understanding can change how a culture defines itself. It can turn practical knowledge into sacred tradition. The ancient Egyptians might not have known exactly how or why the Great Pyramid was first built, but they understood its power. They sensed that it mattered. And so, instead of dismantling it, they embraced it. They made it part of their story, an anchor for their mythology. In doing so, they kept the memory of the forgotten builders alive, even if they no longer knew their names. You can see traces of that process across Egyptian history. As centuries passed, new pharaohs built new pyramids, temples, and tombs, each one an attempt to replicate the perfection of the first. But perfection rarely repeats. The later pyramids are smaller, less precise, more prone to decay. Some collapsed during construction. The skill that once seemed effortless became difficult, then impossible. And yet, the Egyptians never stopped trying. They didn't abandon the idea, they adapted it. The pyramid shape persisted not as engineering, but as symbol. It became the form of sun temples, obelisks, and sacred art. The design survived long after the ability to reproduce it faded, because it had become something more than architecture. It had become faith. There's a quiet irony in that. The very act of forgetting the original purpose might have given the pyramid its immortality. If the Egyptians had known it as merely a monument of the past, they might have left it to erode. But by making it divine, they preserved it. They gave it new meaning, ensuring its survival through thousands of years of change. In that sense, inheritance became creation. The inheritors became builders, once again, not of stone, but of story. They built continuity where there might otherwise have been silence. When you walk through Egyptian temples today, you see walls covered with scenes of gods bestowing authority upon the pharaoh, the heavens mirrored in the halls of men. Columns rise like reeds along the Nile, ceilings painted as night skies filled with stars. Every design, every proportion echoes that first monumental inheritance. Even the smallest shrine carries the same sense of balance, of connection between above and below. It's as if the entire civilization was built to interpret one message written in stone long before its time. And perhaps that's what all inheritance truly is, a translation across ages. Each generation finds its own meaning in what came before, even if that meaning changes. The Egyptians inheriting stone translated it into faith. They turned geometry into myth, physics into philosophy, and the labor of unknown hands into the language of gods. It is a transformation so complete that we might never untangle which parts were original and which were interpretation. But maybe we don't need to. Maybe that's the point. The continuity itself is the message. If the forgotten builders gave the world the structure, the Egyptians gave it a soul. They filled the silent chambers with story, the empty corridors with prayers, the bare stone with symbols. They didn't need to know the original purpose to make it meaningful. They only needed to feel its gravity, the way it seemed to draw reverence from anyone who approached. In that sense, the pyramid became not just a relic of the past, but a living dialogue between generations, a conversation carved into the horizon, always waiting for new voices to join. As the night deepens over the Giza plateau, the air cools and the stars appear once more steady and patient. They look down upon the same stone that has seen their slow drift across the sky for thousands of years. Below them, the river glimmers faintly in the dark, the eternal mirror of the heavens. Somewhere in that reflection, you can almost sense both the builders and the inheritors, the unknown hands that shaped the stone and the known ones that gave it meaning. Together, they built something that outlasted both. And as we linger on that thought, the story continues to unfold, quietly, not ending, but shifting, turning toward those who came later, the ones who tried to understand, to measure, to explain, to balance faith with evidence, the archaeologists, the seekers, the skeptics. The next whisper in the long conversation between stone and curiosity, between what we know and what we still wonder. It's strange how the older a mystery becomes, the more modern minds are drawn to it. There's a quiet magnetism to questions that resist answers, especially when those questions lie buried in the sand. Every archaeologist who steps onto the Giza plateau knows this feeling. The landscape is vast and silent, but it hums with invisible threads of curiosity. They arrive with notebooks, scanners, and theories, carrying the tools of precision into a place built by hands that knew other kinds of precision entirely. They kneel before the same stones that ancient priests once touched, but their prayers are different. They ask for data, for patterns, for confirmation. And yet, what they find most often isn't proof, but paradox. Archaeology at its core is a dialogue between the known and the unknown. It's the slow act of listening to the earth and trying to translate what it says. But the Great Pyramid resists translation. For every new measurement that explains one mystery, two more arise. The dimensions are exact, but also symbolic. The alignments measurable, but mysterious in their purpose. The deeper scientists look, the more the structure behaves like a riddle, one that offers clarity in numbers, but obscurity in meaning. The archaeologist's dilemma begins here, in the tension between precision and understanding. When early excavators first entered the Great Pyramid, they expected treasure. They imagined chambers filled with gold and inscriptions, hieroglyphs, announcing the triumph of a king. Instead, they found emptiness. The main chambers were bare, echoing with silence. There was no body, no ornament, nothing but the careful arrangement of stone. For those used to the decorated tombs of later Egypt, the emptiness felt almost unsettling. It didn't fit the pattern. Some concluded that grave robbers must have taken everything. Others began to wonder if there had ever been anything to take. The structure didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like something else entirely, something functional, purposeful, but beyond definition. Over the centuries, countless explanations have been offered. Some see it as a monument of resurrection, others as a calendar in stone, a mathematical model of the earth, or even a giant observatory. Each theory brings with it a certain beauty and a certain frustration. The data are there, the angles, the ratios, the alignments. But interpretation always runs ahead of proof. For the modern archaeologist, this is both exhilarating and exhausting. Every discovery feels like progress until it circles back to uncertainty. In that sense, the Great Pyramid is both a monument and a mirror. It reflects not just ancient craftsmanship, but the limits of modern certainty. The scientific study of Giza is a story in itself. Early European explorers approached it with romantic awe, imagining lost worlds and hidden chambers. In the 19th century, surveyors like Flinders Petrie brought mathematics to the task, measuring every block with obsessive care. His work revealed a level of precision that seemed almost supernatural for the time it was supposedly built. Each side of the base varied in length by less than a few centimeters, an accuracy difficult to achieve even with modern instruments. Petrie was both impressed and puzzled. He documented the perfection, but he couldn't quite explain it. And so began a long tradition among archaeologists, recording anomalies with admiration, then quietly admitting that some of them defy simple reasoning. In the 20th century, technology began to deepen the investigation. Ground-penetrating radar, seismic surveys, and muon detectors all have been aimed at the pyramid in search of hidden chambers. Each discovery has brought excitement and caution in equal measure. When scientists recently detected a large void above the Grand Gallery, headlines around the world declared it a hidden chamber. But what it means remains unclear. Is it structural a byproduct of engineering? Or is it intentional a space with a forgotten purpose? The tools of modern science can reveal shapes beneath stone, but not the intentions behind them. And so, again, the dilemma deepens. We can measure almost everything, but we still don't know why it exists. To the archaeologist, the challenge isn't just in uncovering artifacts. It's in interpreting them without letting imagination outrun evidence. Yet in places like Giza, imagination is hard to suppress. Standing before a monument that predates nearly all of recorded history, it's impossible not to wonder, was this truly the work of a single civilization, or the inheritance of many? Were the techniques used here rediscovered later or lost forever? The evidence doesn't provide clear boundaries. The more one studies Egypt, the more its timeline feels like a continuum rather than a beginning. Civilizations rise from the remains of others. Progress often looks like memory resurfacing. Every archaeologist who studies the Great Pyramid must confront this uncomfortable truth. The narrative we have is built on fragments. Most of Egypt's earliest records have vanished. Papyrus decays. Stone endures, but it doesn't speak. The few inscriptions we have are snapshots, moments from within a much longer story. The temptation is to fill the gaps, to build continuity where none survives. But the stones resist that too. They seem to hold their own version of time that doesn't care for human chronology. They sit outside of it, serene and absolute. The archaeologist armed with carbon dating and stratigraphy finds themselves facing a monument that refuses to age in the way everything else does. Even among experts, opinions diverge sharply. Some hold firmly to the conventional view that the pyramid was built during Khufu's reign around 2550 BCE by tens of thousands of skilled workers using simple but effective tools. Others argue for a much older origin, citing geological and astronomical data. Between these poles lies a vast spectrum of interpretation, from cautious revisionism to speculative wonder. The problem is that the physical evidence can support multiple readings. The stones themselves don't lie, but they also don't elaborate. They leave room for both reason and myth. For some, that ambiguity is maddening. For others, it's the whole point. Archaeology thrives on the tension between what we know and what we can only guess. The Great Pyramid has become the perfect case study for that tension, a test of patience, humility, and perspective. To dig here is to confront the limits of one's own understanding. Every measurement, every scan is a reminder that knowledge is temporary, but curiosity is eternal. There's another side to the archaeologist's dilemma, the emotional one. Many who study the pyramids describe a peculiar sensation while working there. A sense of being watched not by spirits or superstition, but by history itself. You stand among stones that have seen entire civilizations rise and fall. You measure blocks that were cut before writing existed. The awareness that human hands once placed them with purpose and precision stirs something deeply personal. Archaeology isn't just about the past. It's about connection. To brush dust from a carved line or a tool mark is to shake hands across thousands of years. And in that handshake, there's both awe and melancholy, the realization that we are the inheritors of something we can barely comprehend. Modern archaeology tries to remain objective, But Giza blurs that boundary. The data is solid, yet the mystery feels alive. When new discoveries are made, the world responds with the same wonder it did a century ago. The difference is that now we can measure our wonder with lasers and satellites. We can calculate alignments down to fractions of a degree. We can simulate construction methods with physics models. And yet, for all that progress, the essential mystery remains untouched. It's as if the more clearly we see the stones, the more the story behind them fades into light. There's also the matter of legacy. Archaeologists aren't just studying the past, they're shaping how future generations will remember it. Every interpretation becomes part of a chain of understanding. Just as the Egyptians once layered their own beliefs atop older ones, the responsibility is immense. To declare something proven or disproven can change how the world perceives itself. And so every conclusion about Giza carries weight. Was it built solely by Egyptian ingenuity, or does it stand on foundations older than civilization itself? The answer affects not just history books, but the story humanity tells about its own origins. The dilemma deepens further when science meets wonder. Archaeology demands skepticism, but wonder demands openness. Too much of one and the mystery dies. Too much of the other and the evidence dissolves into fantasy. The Great Pyramid sits exactly between those two poles, challenging anyone who approaches it to balance reason with reverence. The most honest archaeologists admit that they sometimes feel both at once, skeptical of wild theories, but secretly enchanted by the idea that something extraordinary might still lie hidden just beyond reach. Even the tools of modern inquiry are limited by humility. One scans can peer through stone, but not through time. Drones can map the plateau in 3 dimensions, but they can't reconstruct intent. We can recreate ramps, levers, and pulleys, but we can't recreate the mindset of the people who use them. And perhaps that's the true essence of the archaeologist's dilemma, to accept that knowledge can illuminate the structure, but not the spirit behind it. The stones will tell you how they stand, but not why they were made to stand at all. Some researchers have suggested that we may never fully understand the pyramid, not because the data are insufficient, but because our framework for understanding is too narrow. We approach the past with modern categories: religion, science, art, engineering. But the people who built or inherited this monument may not have divided knowledge that way. To them, the practical and the spiritual could have been the same thing. Building the pyramid might have been both a technological feat and an act of devotion. Modern minds trained to separate those concepts struggle to imagine that unity. The archaeologist caught between analysis and awe must navigate that gap carefully. And so the work continues. Year after year, new expeditions arrive. They scan, document, dig, and publish. The picture becomes clearer, yet the meaning grows no simpler. The Great Pyramid endures as a kind of dialogue partner responding to every hypothesis with silence. It's a silence that isn't empty, but patient. The archaeologist learns to listen differently, not for answers, but for understanding. Each block, each grain of sand, each measurement is part of a conversation that began long before science existed and will continue long after it changes form again. At night, when the tools are packed away and the plateau falls quiet, the stars return. The same stars the ancient surveyors once used to align their work now look down upon the modern surveyors aligning theirs. Time folds gently in on itself. Somewhere out there in the cool desert air, a faint breeze moves across the stones, carrying with it the scent of dust and history. The archaeologists sit in small circles, comparing notes under the glow of their lamps, unaware that they read part of the same continuum they study. They, too, are builders, of knowledge rather than monuments, of understanding rather than stone. The difference is only in the material. The impulse is the same, and as their lights dim replaced by the glow of dawn, the pyramid remains unchanged. It doesn't reveal or conceal. It simply exists serene, as ever letting each generation find its own reflection in its shadow. The archaeologists leave with data, questions, and a feeling that's hard to name, a quiet awareness that they've touched something larger than certainty, something that will still be waiting for the next seeker, and the next, and the next. The work never truly ends because the past doesn't end. It only shifts like sand in the wind reshaping its surface, while the foundation remains the same. The archaeologist's dilemma, in the end, may not be a problem to solve, but a reminder to approach mystery not as an obstacle, but as part of what makes discovery meaningful. And as we move from this moment of study and silence into the next thought, the stones remain where they have always been waiting, patient, holding more than any science or faith can quite describe. Their presence bridging the space between understanding and wonder. When you stand close enough to touch the Great Pyramid, what strikes you first is not its height or its age, but its texture. The stone feels cold even under the sun, its surface uneven yet precise. Each block weathered in its own way, but the pattern unmistakably deliberate. It is impossible to look at those stones without thinking of the hands that shaped them, hands that once held tools, guided measurements, lifted weight beyond imagination. Every line, every angle is a signature of intent. But it's not just a record of work. It's a language written in stonecraft, echoing across thousands of years, speaking of patience, precision, and something else we can sense, but barely name. Stone is a kind of memory. It forgets slowly. The marks left by tools linger far longer than the people who used them. When archaeologists study ancient quarries, they often find traces of those forgotten gestures. Cutting lines, wedge marks, hollows where chisels once bit into rock. At Giza, some of those marks make sense, others don't. They appear in places where they shouldn't, or in directions that defy the practical logic of construction. They hint at methods that might have been lost or misunderstood over generations. It's in these inconsistencies that the echoes of earlier craftsmanship begin to emerge, faint but persistent. Imagine one of those quarrymen long before the dynasties we know, standing at the edge of the limestone cliffs near the plateau. He is holding a tool made of something hard enough to leave clean lines in the rock. Copper perhaps, or maybe something now forgotten. The sun is bright, the air dry, and he's carving according to a rhythm he didn't invent, but inherited. The strokes are practiced, each angle deliberate, guided by a system of measurement that's more than functional. It's ritual. He doesn't separate labor from meaning, the physical from the sacred. For him, to shape stone is to participate in something eternal, to give form to a principle that already exists. The pyramid isn't just built. It's summoned into being the way a song is drawn out of silence. That's what the echoes in stonecraft really are. They're not just evidence of technique. They're glimpses of an older mindset, one in which architecture was not a project, but an act of alignment. The stones at Giza are so precise that they almost seem to hum with geometry. Their faces meet at angles so exact they capture sunlight and shadow with mathematical grace. Even the way they were stacked, interlocked, balanced, breathing under the weight of time suggests a deep understanding of matter and motion. To study that craft is to realize that these builders, known or forgotten, were not improvising. They were following a pattern that must have been established long before. Modern engineers often marvel at how those builders achieved such perfection without iron tools, wheels, or pulleys as we know them. They debate the logistics endlessly. Ramps, levers, counterweights, wet sand to reduce friction. Each theory explains part of the process, but none explains the whole. The more we understand about materials and physics, the more extraordinary the result seems. It's as if the builders knew something we've overlooked, not secret technology, but a kind of intimacy with the physical world that modern construction rarely requires. They didn't just work with stone, they listened to it. They understood its grain, its weight, its sound when struck. They used nature itself as their collaborator. In that sense, The echoes in stonecraft are also echoes of relationship, the dialogue between human intention and natural resistance. The precision of the pyramid isn't just about measurement, it's about empathy with material. Every block, though massive, fits into a system that distributes stress flawlessly, keeping the structure stable through earthquakes and centuries of erosion. The builders knew how to make weight support itself, how to let the stone breathe. This isn't a mystery of alien technology or lost magic. It's the wisdom of mastery, the kind of understanding that can only come from generations of direct experience. But mastery alone doesn't explain everything. There's something almost excessive about the precision of the Great Pyramid, as if it was meant to endure far beyond practical necessity. The base, level within millimeters, extends over 13 acres. The corners align to true north, with an error so small that modern surveyors use the structure itself to calibrate instruments. The internal passages form a geometry so consistent that even centuries of earthquakes have not disturbed it. This is engineering with intent beyond durability. It's design with purpose deeper than function. Whoever built it was not only thinking of their own time, but of all time. That sense of eternity embedded in stone is what makes the pyramid so haunting. It was crafted not to belong to a single generation, but to all generations. The echoes of that intention still vibrate through its architecture. Every culture that encounters it feels the same pull to measure it, to decode it, to find meaning in its proportions. And in that shared fascination, we become part of the same continuum. The echoes don't fade, they amplify. The builders may be gone, but through their craftsmanship, they continue to shape how we think, how we dream, how we imagine our own place in history. When you examine the individual blocks of the pyramid, you notice something peculiar. They're not uniform. Each one was cut slightly differently to fit a specific position. It's as though the builders customized every piece, anticipating how it would interlock with its neighbors. This level of foresight requires an astonishing command of spatial reasoning. Modern architects use digital modeling to achieve such precision. Ancient builders did it with eye and intuition. Some blocks even curve subtly, compensating for the Earth's curvature. The monument doesn't impose geometry on the planet. It harmonizes with it. That's craftsmanship elevated to philosophy. And yet, the deeper you study it, the more it resists simplification. The more data we gather, the more intricate the story becomes. The techniques seem both primitive and advanced, simple and sophisticated. The quarry marks suggest manual labor, but the finished surfaces suggest calculation far beyond trial and error. It's possible that the work spanned generations, that what one group began, another completed, refining methods as they went. If that's true, then the echoes in stonecraft are also echoes of continuity. A long relay of knowledge, passed hand to hand, century to century, until the final stone was set and the memory of how it began faded into legend. There are traces of this continuity in later monuments. The step pyramids, the temples, the colossal statues, all carry hints of the same proportions, the same geometry, the same pursuit of balance. But none achieve the same level of perfection. It's as if something essential was remembered imperfectly, like a melody played slightly out of tune. The echo grew fainter, but it never disappeared entirely. You can still hear it in the symmetry of Luxor, in the columns of Karnak, in the obelisks that reach for the sky like frozen rays of sunlight. Even when the exact techniques were forgotten, the aesthetic survived. The idea of harmony, the relationship between stone, light, and meaning remained at the heart of Egyptian art. Some scholars have noticed parallels between Egyptian stonecraft and other ancient sites around the world, structures in Peru, Turkey, and even Japan that exhibit similar precision, similar megalithic ambition. The blocks at Sacsayhuaman, for instance, fit together with the same seamless joints as those at Giza, though built continents apart. It's tempting to imagine a shared origin, a global tradition of early craftsmanship, now mostly lost. That theory remains speculative, but it speaks to something larger, the possibility that human ingenuity, when focused on permanence, tends to converge across cultures. Across eras, the same principles arise: balance, proportion, endurance. Perhaps these aren't coincidences at all, but expressions of a universal instinct to leave something behind that time cannot destroy. In that light, the Great Pyramid is less an anomaly and more a masterpiece within a larger human story. It represents what happens when knowledge, devotion, and time converge perfectly. It's the sound of an entire civilization, or perhaps more than one speaking through stone. And though the exact methods may have changed, the message remains that craftsmanship can outlast culture. That skill can become legacy. The builders might have vanished, but their work continues to instruct, to inspire, to provoke. Or the echoes in stonecraft also raise another question. Why do we still build at all? Modern construction is fast, efficient, and temporary. Buildings go up in months and come down in decades. But the ancients built for eternity. They weren't just creating shelter or monuments. They were expressing belief in continuity itself. They built as if they expected to be remembered, not for who they were, but for what they understood. To carve stone with that intention is to converse with the future. And in that sense, the Great Pyramid is a conversation still in progress. Every time someone studies it, photographs it, or simply stands in its shadow, the dialogue resumes. There's something almost intimate about that idea. The tools have changed, the languages have changed, but the hands remain the same human hands, shaping, measuring, striving for perfection. The echo we hear in the stone is our own reflection. We recognize the same desire to endure, to create order in a chaotic world, to leave behind something that says, we were here. We knew something. The builders might not have known our names, but they built for us nonetheless. And maybe that's why the pyramid continues to resist complete explanation. It's not just a riddle of engineering. It's a mirror of ourselves. To study it is to see how much of our own nature is bound up in the act of creation. The forgotten builders, the Egyptian inheritors, the modern archaeologists, all are parts of the same pattern, each listening for the same faint resonance in stone. The echo doesn't belong to any one era. It belongs to the continuity of thought itself, to the human capacity to reach across time through the permanence of craft. At dusk, when the last light strikes the pyramid's face, the stones seem to glow softly each block, catching the sun's final rays before night falls. The surface looks alive, shifting with color and shadow as if the monument itself were breathing. You can almost imagine that beneath that surface, beneath the layers of limestone and on granite, there's still movement, not physical, but symbolic, the slow vibration of history, the pulse of hands long gone. The stones may not speak, but they remember the language of those who placed them. And as darkness settles and the desert grows still again, the echoes remain. They linger in the air, in the quiet between footsteps, in the steady hum of the night wind brushing against the ancient surface. They remind us that the act of creation never really ends. It reverberates, it transforms. It calls to whoever is willing to listen. Somewhere in that vibration lies the next thread of the story, waiting for the curious, the patient, the dreamers who still stand before the Great Pyramid and feel not just the weight of its stones, but the weight of everything it means. The echoes in stonecraft are not fading. They re-multiplying, resonating through every generation that stops to wonder how such perfection was possible and why it still matters. And as that thought deepens, another begins to rise as naturally as the stars returning to the horizon. The thought of voices older than memory, of myths that might not be myths, of whispers carried through time that still speak of what came before. When night settles over the desert, the air changes, the heat drifts upward, the wind softens, and the silence deepens into something almost tangible. It's easy to imagine that the stillness itself holds memory, that somewhere between the grains of sand and the surface of the stone, something ancient is still speaking. The voices of the ancients aren't loud. They're patient. They don't interrupt. They linger. They wait for quiet minds to listen. Standing beneath the faint glow of the stars, you can almost hear them, not as words exactly, but as impressions, echoes of thought, fragments of intent, faint reminders that the past has not stopped existing. It has only changed its form. The Egyptians, and perhaps those who came before them, believed deeply that nothing truly dies. To them, to speak a name was to make it live again. To forget was the only real death. Maybe that's why their monuments speak without voices, and their carvings show faces gazing calmly through time. They understood that sound fades, but shape endures. They used stone the way we use memory, permanent, where flesh is temporary, precise where words can fail. Every line of hieroglyph, every measured surface, was part of that effort to speak forever. The pyramids, in that sense, are less tombs than syllables in a long sentence about existence. But if the Egyptians were the inheritors of an even older culture, then those older voices might still be present, too layered beneath the later words, like ancient roots under new growth. The myths that reached the earliest Egyptians were already echoes when they received them, echoes from a time before writing, before dynasties, before history. They spoke of golden ages, of gods who walked among men, of floods that erased worlds, of knowledge preserved in secret places. These myths were not unique to Egypt. Versions of them appear in Sumer, in Greece, in India, even in the Americas. Across continents and languages, humanity seems to remember something, some catastrophe, some transition, some inheritance of wisdom from a world now gone. It is tempting to dismiss those shared myths as coincidence, as parallel invention by civilizations facing the same natural fears. Yet the patterns repeat too precisely to ignore. The flood that resets the world, the builders who precede recorded history, the divine teachers who descend to restore order. These are stories told in different tongues, but with the same rhythm. The Egyptians spoke of Thoth, the god of wisdom, who brought writing and science to humanity after chaos had swept them away. The Greeks had Prometheus the Titan, who gave mankind fire. The Sumerians had Enki the clever god, who preserved knowledge before the Great Deluge. In each case, the voice of the teacher speaks from before the beginning, reminding those who follow that civilization is not invented once, but remembered again and again. Perhaps those voices were once human. Perhaps they belonged to the same people who built the early monuments, who mapped the stars and carved the first symbols into stone. Over generations, their names became myth. Their stories became divine. We tend to separate myth from history, but the ancients did not. To them, gods and ancestors were the same continuum. The divine was simply memory raised to the level of reverence. If a people inherited the Great Pyramid without knowing who made it, it's easy to see how they might imagine that it was built by gods. After all, what else could explain such perfection, such endurance? The voices of the builders would have been gone, but the monument would still speak on their behalf. Over centuries, that speech became religion. When we read the earliest Egyptian texts, the pyramid texts, the coffin texts, the Book of the Dead, we find voices trying to preserve a cosmic order that already feels ancient. They speak of resurrection, of journeys through the stars, of transformations of the soul into light. They speak of ascension through shafts that lead towards specific constellations, of crossing the sky as the sun as companion. These aren't random images. They're architectural metaphors drawn directly from the shape and alignment of the Great Pyramid itself. The language of the soul's journey mirrors the geometry of the structure. It is as if the building and the belief were two halves of the same message, one carved in stone, the other written in sound. Perhaps those who first wrote these texts weren't inventing new rituals, but preserving older ones whose origins they barely remembered. When a culture inherits monuments it can't explain, it often reinterprets them as sacred. The Great Pyramid might have been seen as the literal gate to the afterlife, its chambers representing the stages of transformation, its narrow passages aligning with the path of the spirit through the heavens. The voices of the ancients, in that sense, might not just be mythological. They could be the physical layout of the pyramid itself, a message encoded not in language, but in proportion. There's an idea in Egyptology that the ancient world communicated through symbolism more than speech. The Egyptians didn't simply write their ideas, they built them. Every shape, every direction, every number was a word in that architectural vocabulary. If that's true, then the pyramid is not mute. It's speaking constantly, just not in a language we're fluent in anymore. We can measure it, but we can't yet translate it. The voices of the ancients might still be speaking, just not in frequencies we've learned to hear. Over time, as the dynasties rose and fell, those voices continued to change form. The god-kings of early Egypt became intermediaries, then ideals, then stories. The original builders, whoever they were, became divine ancestors. The echoes that began as human intent solidified into theology. What began as engineering became ritual. And yet something of the original message must have survived, because the same idea runs. Like a thread through all of Egyptian culture, the pursuit of balance, the union of opposites, the quest for harmony between heaven and earth. It's there in every myth of Ra rising each dawn, in every depiction of Isis and Osiris restoring order, in every equation carved into temple walls. The voices speak of alignment, of connection, of remembering. They remind us that the world makes sense when we live in tune with it. Even now, standing on the plateau, you can feel that message in the way the stones are arranged, in the way they seem to respond to the sky. The pyramid's proportions, its orientation, even its location near the Nile speak of equilibrium. It's a philosophy made physical. The ancients may have used it to remind themselves that life and death, order and chaos, creation and destruction were all part of a single unbroken cycle. To us, that may sound like spirituality. To them, it was simply truth. When explorers first entered the Great Pyramid's chambers in modern times, they often reported feeling something indescribable, a kind of presence. Not eerie, but profound. Some dismissed it as imagination, others as acoustics or atmospheric pressure. But the feeling is real enough that many still mention it today. The spaces inside the pyramid are designed with precision that affects sound in subtle ways. Voices echo differently depending on where you stand. Some frequencies amplify, others vanish completely. It's possible that these effects were intentionally designed to create resonance during ancient rituals. Imagine a priest chanting in the grand gallery, his voice rising and returning, multiplied by the stone around him. The sound would fill the passageway like a living thing, a conversation between human and monument. The ancients may have believed that by speaking within such a space, they were literally awakening the structure-giving voice to the eternal. Those vibrations, those resonances, might still linger in the rock. Sound is energy, and energy leaves traces. It's strange to think that every word ever spoken inside that chamber, every chant, every breath might still be part of the building's memory, imprinted at a level we can't detect, but that the stone somehow retains. The voices of the ancients, in that sense, are not metaphors at all. They're physical. They're the low hum that fills the air when silence stretches too long. They're the feeling of standing in a place where time folds on itself. It's easy to imagine that those early voices still reach us, not through sound, but through instinct. You can hear them when you look at the sky the way they must have looked, searching for order, for rhythm, for meaning. You can hear them in the careful hands of modern masons, still tracing lines with the same patience. You can even hear them in the language we use to describe mystery, which still borrows words from the ancient world. Foundation, alignment, balance, harmony. The ancients gave us those words. They taught us that the act of building is also the act of remembering. Across history, there are moments when those voices seem to grow louder, when discoveries remind us that we've been here before, that we are rediscovering what someone else already knew. The invention of geometry, the measurement of the stars, the creation of calendars, all of it feels like memory resurfacing rather than innovation. The voices guide us, subtly reminding us of continuity, of the invisible thread that connects us to every builder, thinker, and dreamer who ever stood under this same sky. The desert doesn't erase those voices, it preserves them. The wind that moves over the sand doesn't destroy it, polishes. The same way time smooths away the rough edges of memory, leaving behind the essence. The Great Pyramid, in all its silence, is full of that essence. It's the distilled thought of humanity across ages crystallized in stone. Every generation that approaches it adds its own layer to the chorus. New questions, new interpretations, new awe. The ancients may have built it or inherited it, but the dialogue they began never stopped. Some nights, when the moon is low and the plateau gleams pale and empty, you can almost feel the layers of time stacked like the stones themselves. Each block a century, each joint a forgotten voice. The air carries faint murmurs of languages no one speaks anymore. But the meanings haven't vanished. They've only shifted medium from word to structure, from sound to shape. The ancients still speak through what they made, through the geometry that aligns perfectly with the stars that once guided them. Those stars are still there, though they've drifted slightly in their long procession. The sky still remembering its own past. If you close your eyes there, you can almost sense the continuum. The builders, the priests, the astronomers, the poets, all part of one unbroken conversation about existence. Their words may be lost, but their intention remains intact to connect the human to the cosmic, the temporary to the eternal. The voices of the ancients aren't behind us. They're all around us, woven into the structures that survive, the myths that persist, and the instincts that still drive us to look up, to wonder, to build. And as that awareness settles, soft as the desert air, another thought begins to emerge. The idea that if those voices have been carried this far, they may not be done speaking yet. Perhaps there are still messages waiting in the stone's codes of proportion, clues hidden in design, fragments of knowledge that the ancients tried to preserve for a future they could only imagine. Perhaps those whispers lead not just into the past, but forward towards something rediscovered rather than newly made. When people look at the Great Pyramid and wonder who built it, they're not just asking about construction. They're asking about memory. They're re-asking if humanity has lived more than one lifetime. If our story might have started long before we think it did, only to be interrupted and begun again. This is where the idea of a vanished civilization takes root, not as fantasy, but as a question that refuses to disappear. What if the people who raised the earliest monuments, who aligned stone to the stars with impossible precision, weren't the first of us, but the last of someone else? What if civilization itself is older than its own record? The notion isn't new. It surfaces again and again in history, as if each generation rediscovers it in different language. Plato spoke of Atlantis, a powerful island nation that vanished beneath the sea after losing harmony with the gods. To him, it wasn't just a myth. It was a moral parable about pride and imbalance. But perhaps he was also repeating a memory passed down through the ages, a distorted echo of something that really happened long before written history. Almost every culture has its version. The flood that reset the world, the golden age that fell, the ancestors who built wonders and then disappeared. The Sumerians had Eridu. The Hindus had Devrak. The Maya had their own lost cities swallowed by jungle. Egypt, too, had its myths of pre-dynastic ages ruled by god kings and sages who taught humankind how to build, farm, and remember. These stories don't begin with invention. They begin with loss. Modern archaeology, cautious by nature, rarely entertains such possibilities. Civilizations, according to our textbooks, evolve gradually. Agriculture leads to settlement, settlement to cities, cities to states. But sometimes the evidence hints at something less linear. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, built 12,000 years ago, emerged from a world that supposedly didn't yet know how to farm. This site's massive pillars carved with detailed reliefs predate agriculture by millennia. Its builders possessed organization, knowledge, and artistry that shouldn't have existed then. When it was discovered, it didn't just surprise historians, it unsettled them. The timeline had to stretch. If such sophistication existed there, it's possible it existed elsewhere, too, perhaps in places now buried beneath deserts, jungles, or oceans. The end of the last ice age flooded vast regions of the Earth. Sea levels rose by more than 100 meters, drowning coastlines that would have been fertile and ideal for early settlement. Whole landscapes vanished underwater. River valleys, deltas, plains that might once have held towns, roads, monuments. Today, the remains of those worlds would lie beneath layers of sediment invisible to ordinary archaeology. In that sense, the idea of a vanished civilization isn't just romantic, it's geological. Imagine such a people living at the edge of the Ice Age, watching the world change. They would have known the skies intimately, tracking the movement of stars for navigation and timekeeping. They would have built according to celestial patterns, aligning structures with solstices and equinoxes. Their monuments, if they built any, would have embodied their worldview, a belief that earth and sky were one system, that to build in harmony with it was to participate in creation. Then, as the climate shifted and the floods came, they would have fled inland carrying fragments of knowledge, but losing the infrastructure to express it. Over generations, memory would have turned to myth, and the survivors would have become teachers to simpler peoples. The Egyptians perhaps were among those descendants' heirs to lessons remembered only in part, rebuilding what they could from fragments of an older order. This hypothesis, often called the lost or advanced ancient civilization theory, has been proposed in many forms. Some imagine a global culture connected across continents. Others a few centers of knowledge scattered and later isolated. The evidence, if it exists, is fragmentary. Yet certain clues seem to repeat. Megalithic sites around the world share design features: stone blocks, weighing hundreds of tons, fitted with impossible precision, aligned to stars and solstices. It's not proof of a single civilization, but it hints at shared priorities: permanence, astronomy, geometry, reverence for the sky. These are the fingerprints of minds thinking beyond survival. Egypt, with its monumental calm, feels like a remnant of that tradition. The Great Pyramid's perfection, the Sphinx's weathering, the sudden appearance of advanced stonework in early dynastic times, all of it could be traces of something older, repurposed, and reinterpreted. If we imagine the Egyptians inheriting not just structures, but ideas, the picture changes. The birth of Egyptian civilization becomes not an isolated miracle, but a rebirth, a continuation of an older current that had flowed beneath history all along. What makes this idea both compelling and difficult is that it challenges the framework of progress we rely on. We like to think of history as a steady ascent from primitive to advanced, from ignorance to enlightenment. But the Earth doesn't move that way. It cycles. It creates, destroys, and renews. Civilizations could rise to heights, fall, and rise again without leaving much trace. Stone lasts, but the softer things, wood, fabric, writing, language, vanish. A city built mostly of organic materials could disappear entirely in a few thousand years, leaving only the bones of its monuments behind. What we see as beginnings might actually be midpoints in a much older story. If the vanished civilization existed, it likely didn't vanish in a single event, but in waves. Climate instability around 10,000 BCE reshaped ecosystems worldwide. Glaciers melted, sea levels rose, weather patterns shifted. Massive floods swept across plains that are now dry deserts. Geological evidence supports this, not as myth, but as measurable fact. The end of the Ice Age was catastrophic for many species, and for human communities, dependent on stable environments. The survivors would have migrated, adapted, and forgotten the scale of what they'd lost. By the time their descendants began to rebuild permanent settlements, the memory of their origins would already have drifted into story. Skeptics argue that human beings are simply pattern makers, that given enough monuments and enough stars, some alignments will always fit. That's true, but it doesn't explain the precision. It doesn't explain how structures separated by oceans follow the same geometric principles, or how myths separated by language describe the same cosmic order. Perhaps it's not evidence of a single global culture, but evidence that humanity, whenever it reaches a certain level of stability, begins to look outward and upward, repeating the same observations, guided by the same curiosity. The vanished civilization then might not have vanished completely. It might simply be the collective memory of humanity as first awakening, resurfacing whenever the world is ready to listen again. Still, the idea refuses to stay quiet. Every discovery that pushes civilization's origin further back makes it harder to dismiss. The more we find buried temples, forgotten cities, ancient maps showing knowledge of coastlines that shouldn't have existed, the more plausible the pattern seems. The vanished civilization hypothesis doesn't claim certainty. It doesn't say we know who they were or what they achieved. It simply reminds us that our timeline might be incomplete. It invites humility, the recognition that we might not be the first to know, only the latest to remember. And if that's true, then the Great Pyramid becomes something more than an Egyptian monument. It becomes a bridge, a message from one world to another, a statement carved in materials so durable that even when language, politics, and culture change, the message still stands. The builders may have known they were living at the end of something, not the beginning. They may have built not to celebrate, but to preserve, to carry forward an idea of order through a coming age of disorder. The pyramid's perfect geometry could be their definition of stability, made visible, a diagram of the cosmos meant to survive catastrophe. It's possible that many such monuments once existed scattered across continents, each serving the same purpose, a safeguard against forgetting. Some may still lie buried, misidentified, or eroded beyond recognition. The ocean floor may hold others, their stones overgrown with coral, their angles softened by millennia of tides. If we ever find them, they might not look like cities or temples at first. They might appear as natural formations until studied more closely, geometry hiding inside geology. The Earth has a way of reclaiming everything, but not erasing it completely. In this light, the vanished civilization hypothesis isn't about lost technology or mythical superhumans. It's about continuity of thought. It suggests that the human story is older, deeper, and more cyclical than we've been taught, that progress is not a line, but a wave rising and falling with time. The builders of Giza, whoever they were, stood on the crest of one such wave, capturing its essence before it fell. When we look at the pyramid now, we're not just seeing a monument. We re-seeing the fossil of a moment when humanity understood itself in harmony with the cosmos and sought to express that understanding in the most durable way possible. The question then is not whether a vanished civilization existed, but how much of it still lives within us. We recognize its echoes every time we marvel at order, every time we seek to align what we build with something greater than ourselves. The same impulse that drove those ancient builders drives us still, to measure, to connect, to create symbols that endure beyond our lifetimes. In that sense, the vanished civilization never vanished at all. It simply changed form, continuing through us, through every generation that looks up at the night sky and feels the same quiet awe that someone thousands of years ago must have felt while shaping stone beneath the same stars. And as we return in thought to that plateau, quiet, moonlit, unending, we can almost feel those vanished lives close by, not gone, but folded into the desert, into the architecture, into the silence. They left no names, but they left intention. They left geometry as their voice and patience as their testament. Their civilization might have dissolved, but its soul remains here, whispering through the lines of the pyramid, reminding us that knowledge doesn't disappear. It waits. It waits beneath the sand, beneath the surface of memory ready to be found again. When the world is listening, history has a way of pretending to move forward in straight lines. We imagine it as progress, a slow and constant ascent, each discovery neatly building upon the last. But beneath that comforting illusion, something else is always at work. Time folds, resets, repeats. Civilizations rise, vanish, and return in forms their predecessors would not recognize. Knowledge survives not as a steady flame, but as embers, sometimes glowing bright, sometimes buried in ash, waiting for another spark. To look at the Great Pyramid is to confront that truth directly. It stands like a fossilized moment of awareness, a reminder that what seems like a beginning might, in truth, be a return. When history resets itself, it does so quietly. There is no great announcement, no clear boundary between eras. Instead, there are years of forgetting. The tools grow dull. The words lose meaning. The rituals fade. What was once obvious becomes obscure. And then one day, someone looks up at a monument left behind by those who came before and begins again. That cycle has happened countless times across the planet. Floods, droughts, migrations, wars, each one shuffles the deck of memory, leaving fragments behind. Humanity begins anew each time, rediscovering what it once knew, calling it invention instead of remembrance. The Egyptian civilization, as we know, it rose from one such reset. It emerged at the precise moment the Sahara transformed from green to gold. When the rains retreated and the people who once roamed the fertile grasslands gathered along the Nile there, among the ruins of an earlier world, they began to build again. They organized, measured, and aligned their lives to the cycles of the river and the stars. But some of the knowledge they used already felt inherited. The way they aligned their temples, the geometry of their pyramids, even their myths about the gods descending from the sky all carried the faint fingerprints of a memory older than they were. They may not have known it consciously, but they were participating in a restoration. The past was being reassembled in new form. That restoration happens every time the earth changes enough to wipe the slate clean. When glaciers melt, when forests turn to desert, when coastlines shift, the records of the past disappear with them. Human beings adapt quickly, but their stories take longer to rebuild. The survivors of one age rarely recognize themselves as the ancestors of another. To them, it feels like they are the first. But somewhere in their myths, in their rituals, in the things they build, and the stars they choose to honor, fragments of the old world remain. They surface as déjà vu, as inexplicable precision, as knowledge that shouldn't exist yet. The cycle continues quiet, but relentless. You can see that pattern in every civilization that has left its mark on the earth. Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, the Andes, the Yucatan all began suddenly as if from nowhere, with architecture and mathematics already fully formed. Their calendars, their astronomical alignments, their myths about floods and creation all point backward to something shared. Each one seems to remember in its own way that the world had started before and ended before and would do so again. The Great Pyramid fits perfectly within that rhythm. It may have been built as a monument to eternity, but eternity in human history is never static. It renews itself by forgetting. When historians study the layers of ancient Egypt, they notice a strange phenomenon. The earliest periods show astonishing innovation architecture, art, language followed by centuries of repetition. The same forms, the same proportions, the same rituals persist with little change for millennia. It's as if the civilization reached a level of perfection early on and then sought only to preserve it. But preservation is another kind of forgetting. When culture focuses on maintaining what it has rather than expanding what it knows, it becomes a mirror instead of a window. Egypt's stability was remarkable, But it may also have been a symptom of an older trauma, the memory of a loss, of a world that had already ended once. Perhaps they built their monuments not to celebrate permanence, but to defend against erasure, to build something that can survive catastrophe as a way of resisting the reset. The Great Pyramid might have been precisely that, an anchor for memory. Its geometry, its alignment, its sheer durability, all serve one purpose: to outlast the cycles that erase everything else. It was built not only to house something, but to preserve an idea, to remind the future that order can exist even after chaos. In that sense, it is less a tomb and more a time capsule carrying knowledge across the gulf between ages. Some researchers believe that the proportions of the Great Pyramid encode mathematical constants, pi, phi, even the dimensions of the Earth itself. If so, it may have been intended as a message to the future, a way of saying, we knew this once. Remember it again. Whether by design or coincidence, those relationships are real. The perimeter of the pyramid's base corresponds closely to the circumference of the Earth divided by 2. Its height relates to its base as the radius to the circumference of a circle. Its orientation to true north is almost flawless, as if the builders knew the planet's orientation in space with precision we only regained recently. Perhaps that knowledge wasn't new then, but preserved, carried through oral tradition, myth, or sacred geometry, waiting to be rebuilt when conditions allowed. The idea that history resets itself doesn't necessarily mean everything is lost. Some things endure precisely because they are too important to vanish. Language changes, but patterns persist. The human eye still sees beauty in the same ratios. The human mind still seeks the same patterns in the stars. The pyramid in this way is a crystallization of continuity. It bridges the gap between what was forgotten and what was rediscovered. It's a reminder that even if civilizations die, their questions survive. When we look back at history, it's tempting to separate it into eras: prehistory, antiquity, modernity. But the Earth doesn't recognize those divisions. It turns in cycles, endlessly reshaping its own surface. The Ice Age didn't end, it transformed. The floodplains that once nurtured early humanity became deserts, and those deserts will one day bloom again. The people who built the Great Pyramid may have seen themselves as living at the end of an age, building a monument to preserve something before the next beginning. The Egyptians who came later may have seen it as proof that the gods favored them, and we standing here now see it as evidence of intelligence we can't fully explain. Each perspective is part of the same cycle of remembrance and reinvention. There's an old phrase often used in archaeology: continuity through catastrophe. It means that even when the world collapses, something always survives to seed the next one. The pyramid embodies that principle. Its survival through earthquakes, invasions, and erosion is literal. But its endurance as an idea is even more striking. No other structure has shaped human imagination for as long. Every era projects itself onto it, each seeing something different, yet always the same essence. To the ancients, it was divine. To the medieval scholars, it was a mystery of proportion. To the modern world, it is an engineering marvel. And to the future, it may yet be a message from before history began. In that sense, the pyramid is both symptom and cure of history's resets. It exists because forgetting is inevitable, but it endures so that forgetting will never be complete. It's the embodiment of humanity's refusal to let meaning dissolve entirely. When history starts over, the first things to return are always stories, then measurements, then monuments. We rebuild because we remember faintly that we once could. That's the rhythm that defines us. Each time civilization collapses, the survivors rebuild faster, armed with fragments of what was lost. The resets don't erase progress, they refine it. You can see this pattern mirrored in smaller cycles too. The rise and fall of empires, the loss and rediscovery of science, the repetition of art forms that seem to reappear from nowhere. The Renaissance, for instance, wasn't an invention, but a remembering. Europe rediscovered Greek geometry, Egyptian proportion, Roman engineering, all things known, forgotten, and known again. The same could be said for countless other renaissances across cultures. The pattern is recursive, like the spiral of a shell or the orbit of a planet. Progress isn't a straight climb. It's a rhythm. Perhaps the most humbling aspect of that rhythm is how little control we have over it. Civilizations rarely know when they're peaking. The builders of great monuments often believe they are securing the future, not realizing they're leaving messages for people far beyond it. When history resets, it doesn't warn us. It arrives quietly like the shift of wind before a storm. The ground changes, the rivers move, and the old ways no longer fit. What survives are the things too stubborn or too sacred to discard: stone, myth, and the need to make sense of both. The Great Pyramid, therefore, can be seen as both artifact and prophecy. It tells us that what was known once will be known again, and that what we call lost may simply be waiting. Every generation that studies it, every archaeologist that measures its angles, every wanderer who stands before it in awe, becomes part of that ongoing act of remembering. The reset doesn't erase meaning. It invites rediscovery. Each age must find its own language for the same truths. The form changes. The essence endures. Standing before the pyramid at dawn, as the first light touches its worn limestone edges, you can almost feel that continuity moving through time like a current. The structure isn't just old, it's timeless. It carries the weight of all the ages that have touched it, and all the ones that will. The wind that brushes against it now is the same wind that once filled the sails of boats along the ancient Nile, that once carried dust from vanished worlds across continents. The same light that reveals it each morning has shone on civilizations that came and went without leaving a trace. And still, it stands a fixed point in a moving world. When history resets itself, the new world always begins in the ruins of the old, sometimes literally, sometimes symbolically. The builders of the next era don't start from nothing. They start from memory even if they don't recognize it as such. They inherit stories, symbols, proportions, instincts, and from those fragments, they create something that feels new, though it's as old as thought itself. The Great Pyramid is the clearest evidence of that process. It isn't the beginning or the end of civilization. It's the hinge between them. And perhaps that's why it continues to affect us so deeply. It doesn't belong entirely to the past or the present. It exists in both. It's a monument to the idea that knowledge can sleep, but it doesn't die. When history resets itself, the same questions always return. Who are we? Where did we come from? What endures? The answers may shift, but the asking never does. And in that endless asking, in that patient continuity of wonder, humanity keeps finding its way back to itself. And so, as the desert wind rises again, as it has countless times before, sweeping fine grains of sand against the ancient stone, the cycle continues. The pyramid waits, as it always has, as it always will, through every forgetting and remembering, through every fall and descent, through every reset of history's long recurring dream. There is a moment when the sun rises over the Giza plateau and the Great Pyramid catches the light in a way that makes it seem alive. The edges sharpen, the shadows slide along its faces with impossible precision. For a few minutes, the monument glows as if it remembers what it was built for. People have stood there for thousands of years, watching that same light. Farmers, pharaohs, travelers, archaeologists. Each of them saw the same geometry and felt something familiar, something that speaks to the core of what it means to be human. Because the pyramid, for all its mystery and weight, is not only about the past, it's about the human dream of permanence, of purpose, of reaching upward towards something we can never quite touch. To dream, for humans, is to build. The impulse is the same. We imagine a world, and then we shape it until it exists outside of us. The Great Pyramid is the purest form of that impulse. It's a dream given mass and idea turned into stone. It embodies the moment when thought outlived flesh. The people who conceived it may have believed they were building for gods or for eternity or for both. But beneath those beliefs was something simpler, the desire to leave behind proof that we were here, that we understood something, that we could make order from chaos. That desire is as old as the species itself and as enduring as the stones that carried it. The pyramid takes that dream and magnifies it to its extreme. It's both humble and audacious. It's humble because it obeys nature's laws perfectly. Gravity, geometry, alignment. It doesn't fight the earth. It flows with it. Yet, it's audacious because it tries to defy time, to resist the very decay that defines everything else. Most of what humans build eventually collapses. Wood rots, metal rusts, cities crumble. But the pyramid still stands, weathered but intact, the oldest of the 7 wonders and the only one that remains. It's as if the human dream itself found a way to survive every fall, every reset, every forgetting. When you look at it long enough, the shape begins to reveal something almost psychological. The base, vast and steady, represents everything we know: the earth, the body, the tangible. The apex points toward what we don't know: the sky, the mind, the infinite. Every stone between those two extremes is a step of ascent, a translation from matter to meaning. The dream that built the pyramid wasn't just about structure. It was about transcendence. To build something so enduring was to say that consciousness could be preserved in form, that ideas could be made eternal if you gave them the right shape. That idea has followed us ever since. Every monument, every cathedral, every spacecraft launched into the void is an echo of it. The materials change, but the dream doesn't. We're still building pyramids, just in different forms. We build data pyramids, digital archives, vast networks meant to outlast us. We construct systems of knowledge, libraries of code, artificial intelligences designed to remember what we can't. All of it is driven by the same quiet wish that something of us will remain when the next reset comes. It's tempting to think of the pyramid as the pinnacle of human achievement, but perhaps it's better understood as a reflection of human longing. It wasn't built out of necessity. It wasn't shelter or defense. It was built because people wanted to touch eternity. They wanted to stand at the intersection of heaven and earth and know that they'd bridged it, even for a moment. The dream behind it isn't about conquest or ego. It's about connection. It's about the realization that existence feels incomplete without continuity, that we're always trying to link the temporary to the infinite. That's why the pyramid feels both alien and familiar. It embodies a state of mind we all recognize but rarely sustain. A calm certainty that the world makes sense, that everything has order if we align ourselves with it correctly. To stand before it is to feel that order physically, to sense the harmony between structure and universe. The lines meet exactly where they should. The weight rests where it must. The angles point to the same stars that have watched us since before history. It's not just architecture. It's meditation made solid. Ancient texts describe the pyramids as machines of ascension, not in the mechanical sense, but in the spiritual one. They were designed to lift the soul from the mortal to the eternal, guiding it through levels of understanding symbolized by the layers of stone. Whether that belief originated with the Egyptians or was inherited from an even earlier culture, the principle is the same. The pyramid transforms the act of building into a metaphor for consciousness itself. Each level rises above the last, smaller, more refined, closer to the light. To reach the top is to reach understanding. And yet, even as we read those metaphors, we can't help but feel that they describe something literal as well. The human brain, the structure of our societies, even our hierarchies have fought all, mirror the same pyramid pattern. We build from the ground up, stacking knowledge upon experience until we reach insight. The pyramid is not just a monument. It's a model of how humans think. Every generation builds upon the last, adding layers, refining angles, striving toward clarity. The dream of perfection never disappears. It simply changes shape. What makes the Great Pyramid so haunting is that it succeeded. It achieved the impossible. It turned an idea into something time could not erase. The builders didn't just imagine eternity, they engineered it. And in doing so, they left us a question. Why does this structure feel so much like us? Why does it seem to understand our need for meaning better than most of our own creations do? The answer may lie in the fact that it was built with awareness of limitation. The pyramid doesn't defy time by ignoring it. It defies time by cooperating with it. Its proportions channel wind and sunlight in ways that slow decay. Its mass anchors it so deeply that earthquakes ripple around it rather than through it. It's not immortal. It's adaptable. That's the secret of all lasting things. Perhaps that's the real lesson the pyramid carries through ages. The human dream is not to conquer nature, but to live in rhythm with it so perfectly that the two become indistinguishable. The builders didn't impose their will on the world. They collaborated with it. They listened to the landscape, to the materials, to the stars. The result was harmony so precise that it still resonates millennia later. That resonance is the sound of understanding. It's the dream of humanity in its clearest form, to find balance between what is and what could be. Even the myths surrounding the pyramid reflect that harmony. The ancient Egyptians believed that the soul, upon death, had to navigate a series of trials to reach the afterlife. It had to weigh its heart against a feather to speak truth, to pass through gates guarded by knowledge. The pyramid, with its ascending passages and hidden chambers, mirrors that journey exactly. Whether intentional or not, it's as though the builders mapped the structure of consciousness itself into stone. To travel through it was to move from darkness to light, from confusion to understanding. The architecture wasn't symbolic of the journey. It was the journey. Modern people standing in its shadow still feel that pull. Even those who come with no belief in gods or afterlives often describe a sense of peace there, a slowing of thought, a softening of time. The pyramid seems to operate on a frequency that quiets the mind. Maybe it's the geometry. Maybe it's the vastness. Maybe it's just the accumulated presence of thousands of years of human attention focused on one object. Whatever the cause, it reminds us of something easily forgotten in modern life. That to dream well, we must first be still. In that stillness, the pyramid feels almost like a heart. Its mass is not oppressive, but steady like a pulse beneath the desert. You can stand there in silence and feel the air move against the surface, the temperature shift with the light, the faint vibration of the ground as wind crosses the plateau. It's alive, but in a way we've stopped recognizing. It doesn't move quickly. It doesn't speak in sound. Its language is balance, patience, and endurance. That's the language of all great dreams. We've inherited that language, even if we've forgotten its syntax. The skyscrapers that define modern skylines follow the same logic. Broad bases, narrowing summits reaching for the sky. The satellites orbiting above Earth are the new monuments to our longing. They don't weigh millions of tons, but they serve the same function: to connect heaven and earth, to prove that we can reach upward and endure. The pyramid is the seed of that impulse, the first articulation of the belief that humanity and the cosmos are not separate stories. In that sense, the Great Pyramid isn't ancient at all. It's ongoing. It's the constant presence of our oldest aspiration, to create something that can outlive us, something that speaks for us when we're gone. It's a reminder that dreaming is a form of construction, that every idea worth keeping must be given structure, proportion, and purpose. The builders of Giza didn't just imagine eternity. They gave it architecture. Every culture since has tried to do the same in its own way, through art, through science, through the quiet act of remembering. And maybe that's what the pyramid truly represents: not a mystery to solve, but a mirror of ourselves. It shows us the scale of our ambition and the fragility of our lives. It reminds us that we are capable of creating permanence out of impermanence, meaning out of silence. The human dream is not to escape time, but to converse with it, to leave behind something that continues the dialogue when we no longer here to speak. When night returns to the plateau and the stars begin their slow drift across the sky, the pyramid fades back into shadow. Its sharp lines blur, its massive form softens, and for a few hours it becomes part of the landscape again, indistinguishable from the hills and darkness around it. But it's still there, patient, waiting for light to return. That rhythm, illumination, and shadow, day and night, is the rhythm of human existence too. We rise, we fall, we forget, we remember. Through it all, the dream remains. And perhaps that's why the Great Pyramid continues to draw us across time and distance. It's not just an object of fascination. It's a reflection of the part of us that refuses to vanish, the part that keeps building, keeps imagining, keeps seeking meaning, even in the face of impermanence. The pyramid is the shape of that refusal made eternal. It's what happens when the human dream meets the patience of stone. And as that thought settles, the story carries us forward again quietly, naturally toward the idea that what we've inherited isn't just stone or mystery or myth, but wonder itself. The sense that even after all this time, there's still something worth discovering, still a reason to keep looking upward, still a conversation between the earth and the sky that hasn't ended yet. When night fully falls over Giza, the world becomes very still. The air cools, the horizon fades into shadow, and the last traces of light linger against the edges of the pyramid, like embers that refuse to die out. It feels less like darkness arriving and more like the world taking a slow breath. You can stand there in the quiet and feel the weight of the desert beneath your feet, the slow drift of time around you, and the strange awareness that this place, this single point on the earth, has been awake far longer than memory. There's no sound but the faint whisper of wind across the stone. And yet, it feels as though something is still speaking softly, patiently. It's difficult to describe that feeling without reducing it. You sense the presence of everything that has ever stood here before you. The builders, the priests, the wanderers, the scholars, all part of the same long thread of human curiosity. You realize that wonder is the one inheritance that never fades. Knowledge can be lost, languages forgotten, monuments eroded, but wonder endures. It's the quiet force that pulls one generation toward the work of the last, the thing that makes us rebuild, rediscover, reinterpret. It's the echo that carries through every cycle of civilization. And in that sense, the Great Pyramid isn't just a monument. It's a relay point in the continuity of wonder itself. When we speak about inheritance, we often think of material things, land, objects, traditions, written history. But the inheritance that matters most is intangible. It's the instinct to ask questions, to look at the sky and wonder why it moves the way it does, to trace the stars and find patterns, to look at stone and see possibility. The Egyptians inherited that instinct, perhaps, from people even older than they knew, and they expressed it in the only way that could last, by turning it into form. Every cut of the stone, every calculation of the angle, every alignment to the stars was an act of reverence for the questions that define being human. That's what makes the Great Pyramid timeless. It's not a monument to answers, but to inquiry. It stands because the people who built it understood that curiosity is sacred, the same curiosity that drove them to align it to Orion, to study the flooding of the Nile, to track the movement of the sun across the horizon. That's the same curiosity that drives us now. We've changed our tools, but not our purpose. We still look for meaning in patterns, still try to connect the physical world to the invisible one. The inheritance of wonder is the invisible thread running through all of it. The pyramid embodies that inheritance perfectly. It has no inscriptions telling us what to believe. It offers no direct explanation, no command, no doctrine. Its silence is its greatest generosity. It invites us to find our own meaning within it, to project our own questions, our own sense of awe. That openness is why it has survived not just physically, but spiritually. It can be studied by scientists, revered by mystics, admired by poets, and each finds something different within it. It doesn't belong to one culture or one belief system. It belongs to anyone who still feels that pull to stand before something vast and ask quietly how. That feeling connects us not just to the Egyptians, but to every human being who has ever looked at the world and seen something greater than themselves reflected in it. It is the same impulse that made the first humans look up from their fires to the stars, the same instinct that carved shapes into cave walls, built temples from stone, and later telescopes from glass. Wonder is recursive. It feeds on itself, growing with every discovery, every unanswered question. The more we learn, the more there is to learn. The pyramid reminds us of that, standing there with the patience of eternity, letting each new generation see it as if for the first time. The strange thing about wonder is that it doesn't need certainty to survive. In fact, it thrives in uncertainty. The less we know, the more we feel it. The Egyptians must have felt that too. For all their knowledge, all their alignment and measurement, they still filled their world with mystery. Their gods were not answers. They were expressions of awe. Their rituals were ways of participating in wonder rather than solving it. They didn't need to understand everything to find meaning. They built meaning into the act of observing itself. That's what we often forget, that knowledge and wonder are not opposites. One doesn't replace the other. They complete each other. When you stand before the Great Pyramid, now under the same stars that once guided the ancient astronomers, you can feel how small you are, but also how connected. The light that left those stars thousands of years ago arrives at your eyes now, carrying the same photons that fell upon the stones when they were new. You are standing in the same light as the builders. In that moment, time dissolves a little. The distance between then and now shrinks until you can almost sense the continuity of experience. The same awe, the same humility, the same desire to understand. That is the inheritance of wonder, transmitted not through words or blood, but through awareness itself. There's something almost comforting in that thought. Civilizations may come, but the impulse that built them never disappears. The forgotten builders, the Egyptians, the archaeologists, the dreamers of today, they're all participants in the same long conversation. Each adds something. Each listens, each passes it on. The Great Pyramid is the meeting point of those voices, the place where curiosity accumulates and transforms into form. It's a mirror of what humanity is at its best: patient, observant, capable of creating something that transcends its own mortality. And maybe that's the quiet message the pyramid holds for anyone who stops to listen. That wonder isn't something we acquire. It's something we remember. It's the most ancient inheritance we have, the one that predates all others. Every time we rediscover it, history begins again. Every time we lose it, history pauses. The pyramid stands as a safeguard against that pause, a reminder carved into the world that the act of wondering is what keeps us alive as a species. It doesn't matter whether we ever fully understand who built it or why. The mystery is not the obstacle. It's the point. Somewhere in that understanding, you start to see how deeply the human dream and the human inheritance intertwine. To build something so enduring requires belief in the future, in the idea that someone will come after you and care enough to look. The builders may never have known our names, but they built for us. And in looking back and trying to understand them, we complete the circle. We become the continuation of their purpose, the next carriers of the same light. That continuity is what makes civilization more than a sequence of empires. It makes it a single ongoing experiment in remembering. It's strange how the longer the pyramid stands, the more it seems to belong to everyone. Each person who visits it leaves with their own impression, their own interpretation, but the core remains untouched. It absorbs meaning the way the desert absorbs sunlight slowly, endlessly, without ever being full. That adaptability is why it endures. It was built not to preserve a specific truth, but to preserve the possibility of truth. The Egyptians may have thought of it as a stairway to the stars, but it is also a stairway between minds, connecting the questions of one age to those of another. If you look closely at the limestone surface, where time has worn it smooth, you can still see the traces of individual blocks, the faint seams where human hands once placed them. Those seams are like fingerprints left on the face of eternity. They remind us that behind every monument, no matter how perfect, there were people, tired, sweating, patient, determined. Their work wasn't just physical labor. It was participation in something far greater than themselves. They built not just for a king or a god, but for the continuity of meaning itself. Every block was a fragment of devotion to the idea that understanding the world is worth the effort, even if the understanding never ends. And so the pyramid continues to teach not through explanation, but through presence. It teaches patience, reminding us that some questions are meant to unfold slowly. It teaches humility, showing us how small we are against the scale of time. It teaches continuity, proving that ideas can survive even when everything else disappears. But most of all, it teaches wonder, the quiet, endless kind that doesn't demand an answer, only attention. If you listen closely in that desert stillness, you can almost hear that lesson taking shape in your own thoughts. It isn't loud, it isn't dramatic, it's gentle like a breath. It asks the same lesson the wind has been whispering against the stone for millennia, the same lesson the stars have been repeating as they trace their slow paths overhead. That to be human is to look, to ask, to build, to leave behind not just structures, but a sense of connection. That our inheritance is not the monuments themselves, but the wonder that made them possible. And maybe that's what the forgotten builders wanted us to feel, not awe for their power, but recognition of their intention. Maybe they built not to impress, but to communicate. Maybe the pyramid is not a message from the past, but a reminder from humanity to itself, to never stop being curious, to never stop listening to the quiet language of the world. Because the moment we stop wondering, the moment we believe we already know, is the moment the cycle of renewal pauses. When dawn finally approaches again, the desert glows faintly with returning light. The air cools even more. The horizon blushes, and the edges of the pyramid reappear as if it's waking from a long, slow dream. You can see it then as both ancient and new, unchanged, yet always beginning again. The world spins. History resets. Civilizations rise, fall, and rise once more. But the inheritance of wonder continues unbroken. And as the first light of morning touches the summit, you realize that maybe this is what the pyramid was always meant to show. That everything we build, everything we dream, everything we reach for is part of one continuous act of remembering. The stone endures, the questions endure, and through them, so do we.